Story 1. It was the first late evening at the museum I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. My name is Rachel. I was 21, working on a research paper for my university history class. The deadline was creeping up fast, and I needed specific details about a collection of 19th century artifacts the local museum had just put on display. The only time I could go was late on a Thursday evening. The museum stayed open until 9 p.m., but most people cleared out by 6. I arrived around 7:30. The weather outside was awful, just a constant freezing rain. I think that kept the usual crowds away. When I walked through the main doors, the massive marble lobby was basically empty, with just one security guard near the entrance looking at his phone. I bought my ticket from the automated kiosk and decided to rent an audio guide. I figured it would give me more context without having to read every plaque. The guide was a thick, heavy plastic rectangle with cheap foam headphones attached. It looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. You had to press the physical numbers on the keypad corresponding to the exhibit. I slipped the headphones over my ears, grabbed my notebook, and headed toward the East Wing. The East Wing was where the temporary exhibits were held. Walking through the grand arches, I immediately noticed how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that makes your footsteps sound way too loud. The floors were polished hardwood, and every time my sneakers hit the ground, a squeak echoed down the dimly lit corridors. The museum had a specific smell, a mix of floor wax, old paper, and dust. I found the 19th century exhibit and typed the number 12 into my bulky guide. A crisp, professional British man's voice started playing in my ears. He gave a standard introduction to the era, talking about industrialization. I walked slowly from glass case to case, looking at old pocket watches and heavy wool clothing. For the first 30 minutes, everything was normal. I was taking notes, pausing the audio when needed, and moving steadily through the winding rooms. But as I went deeper into the wing, I realized I hadn't seen another person since I left the lobby. Not a single patron. The further back I went, the dimmer the lighting seemed to get. The museum used motion sensor lights in the less popular areas. They would flick on as you stepped into a new section, and the ones behind you would shut off with a soft click. It created this isolating feeling, like I was moving through a small bubble of light in a massive building. I didn't hate it, though, and actually liked having the space to myself. I stopped in front of a display featuring early medical equipment. It was a tall cabinet filled with weird, rust-colored tools and dark glass bottles. I typed the number 24 into my guide. The narrator began speaking, explaining crude surgical practices. I leaned close to the glass to look at a terrifyingly large bone saw. As the narrator spoke, I noticed a slight change in the audio quality. It sounded like static was slowly bleeding into the track. The voice started to sound muffled, like the speaker was moving away from the microphone. I fiddled with the volume dial, thinking it was just a low battery. The static cleared up for a second, but then the narrator's tone changed. It wasn't a dramatic shift, just different. He stopped talking about the medical tools mid-sentence. There was a pause of dead air, maybe 3 or 4 seconds long. I pulled my notebook away, waiting for him to continue. Then the voice came back, but the professional enthusiasm was gone, replaced by a flat whisper. He said, "Notice the distinct lack of reflection in the glass before you." I frowned and looked at the display case, confused by the weird instruction. I looked at the glass, and I could clearly see my own reflection of my dark hair and gray sweater staring back at me. I assumed it was some kind of artsy commentary about the people who used to own these tools being gone. I hit the next button, hoping to skip the weirdness and get back to the facts. The audio guide beeped, and a new track started. I moved to the next exhibit, a mock-up of a Victorian parlor room. It was set up behind a velvet rope, complete with antique armchairs, a faded rug, and a creepy porcelain doll. I typed in number 25. The static was back immediately, but this time it wasn't the British man speaking. The voice was entirely different, sounding distorted, lower, and gravelly. It didn't sound like a pre-recorded track at all. It sounded like someone speaking directly into a cheap microphone in an empty room. The voice breathed heavily for a moment before saying, "The parlor was a place of gathering, a place to sit, to wait, and to watch the door." I stood perfectly still, my pen hovering over my notebook. The delivery was so incredibly unsettling, and there was no educational value to it. I looked around the empty room. The lights behind me had already timed out, leaving the hallway I just walked through in total darkness. The only light was the warm spotlight shining on the antique armchairs. I tried to convince myself it was just a strange, immersive part of the exhibit. The distorted voice continued. "Notice how quiet the room becomes when you are the only one left." I swallowed hard as the hair on the back of my neck started to stand up. How did the recording know I was alone? It was a general track, meant for hundreds of people, so it had to be a coincidence. I reached for the keypad to turn the device off, my thumb hovering over the power button. Before I could press it, the gravelly voice spoke again, dropping into a harsh, wet whisper. "The girl in the gray sweater should not be here." My heart slammed against my ribs, and all the breath left my lungs in a sudden rush. I looked down at my clothes to confirm I was wearing an oversized gray knit sweater. A wave of cold dread washed over me because this couldn't be a coincidence. There was absolutely no way a pre-recorded track from a decade ago could know what I was wearing right now. I froze, too terrified to even take the headphones off, while my eyes darted around the dim parlor exhibit. Nothing was moving, and the porcelain doll sat perfectly still on the table. But the air in the room felt incredibly heavy, like the atmospheric pressure had suddenly dropped. My hands started shaking as I gripped the plastic audio guide. The voice in my ears took another slow, ragged breath. It sounded so close, as if the person was standing inches away from my shoulder. "Notice the footsteps behind you," the voice whispered. I squeezed my eyes shut, paralyzed by the sheer terror gripping my chest. I didn't hear anything at first, just the hammering of my own pulse in my ears. Then a sound broke through the heavy silence, a very faint, slow creak of the hardwood floor. It came from the dark hallway I had just walked down, and I couldn't breathe. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The floorboards creaked again with a heavy, deliberate step. It was closer this time. The distorted voice through the foam headphones let out a low hum that sounded almost like a laugh. "Do not turn around," it whispered, and that command broke my paralysis. Panic completely took over, so I let out a choked gasp and ripped the foam headphones off my ears. I expected the sudden removal to plunge me back into the quiet safety of the museum. I expected the silence to prove it was all just a broken machine or my exhausted imagination. But when the headphones fell around my neck, the silence didn't return. The horrifying realization hit me like a physical blow because the distorted voice hadn't been coming through the headphones. It was coming from the dark room right behind me. Even with the plastic device hanging uselessly against my chest, the gravelly whisper continued, echoing softly off the high museum ceilings. "I told you not to look," the voice hissed, completely unamplified by any speaker. I didn't turn around, and I definitely didn't look back into the darkness. I dropped my notebook, turned on my heel, and sprinted blindly toward the exit. My sneakers slammed against the hardwood, echoing violently through the empty halls. I ran through the motion sensor zones so fast the lights couldn't even keep up, leaving me sprinting through pitch-black stretches of the museum. I didn't stop until I burst into the brightly lit main lobby. The security guard jumped up from his desk, startled by my sudden appearance. I was gasping for air, pointing wildly toward the east wing. He walked a few steps down the corridor, shining his heavy flashlight into the gloom, but he found absolutely nothing. Nobody was there. I left the building without another word, walked out into the freezing rain, and sat in my locked car for 20 minutes before I could calm down enough to drive. I never went back for my notebook. I don't know who or what was in that museum with me. But I know that the voice I heard wasn't a recording, and whatever was speaking to me was standing right there in the dark. Story 2. Back in the time I spent driving empty highways, I worked the night shift at a gas station. I used to think the scariest thing I'd see was a drunk customer. I was wrong. The station was located just off a desolate stretch of interstate in the middle of nowhere. It was one of those highways bordered by suffocating pine trees. My shift usually ended around 2 a.m., which meant my 40-minute drive home was always pitch black. I actually used to enjoy that drive. It was quiet. It gave me time to clear my head. But that one drive completely ruined the dark for me. It was mid-November and the air was biting cold. I had just locked up the station and climbed into my sedan. The heater took forever to warm up, so I was shivering as I pulled onto the empty highway. There wasn't a single pair of headlights behind me, just endless dark asphalt stretching out in front of me, illuminated only by my high beams. I turned on the radio, but all I could pick up was static. I decided to just ride in silence. I had been driving for about 15 minutes when I passed an old, broken-down billboard. I had seen it 100 times before. The wood was splintered and the top right corner had collapsed inward. I drove past it, barely giving it a second thought. My eyes were heavy, and I was just focused on getting home. A few miles later, the road started to feel unusually straight. There was a slight curve I always took around this point, but the road just kept extending directly forward. I figured I was just tired. That was when I heard the first sound. It wasn't loud, just a dull, heavy thud. It sounded like it came from the road behind me, maybe 100 feet back. I immediately glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see a blown tire. But there was nothing, only the red glow of my taillights fading into the darkness. I checked my dashboard, no warning lights. I shook my head, blamming my exhausted brain, and pressed down slightly on the gas pedal. About 10 minutes later, my headlights caught something tall on the side of the road. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. It was the broken-down billboard, the exact same one, splintered wood, top right corner collapsed inward. I stared at it as I drove past. I hadn't taken any exits, I hadn't turned around. There was only one of those signs on this entire stretch of highway. I actually let out a nervous laugh, talking out loud to myself just to break the silence. I told myself I must have fallen asleep for a split second and got turned around. even though I knew that made no sense. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. The heater was finally blowing warm air, but I felt a sudden chill run down my arms. I reached over and locked all the doors. It was an involuntary reaction, just a stupid instinct when you feel like something isn't right. I kept my eyes glued to the road ahead, waiting for the familiar curve to appear. Then I heard it again, thud. This time it was louder. It sounded closer, like something heavy dropping onto the asphalt, maybe 50 feet behind my bumper. My eyes shot to the rearview mirror again, still nothing. The darkness behind my car felt thicker somehow, like it was pressing up against the rear window. A logical part of my brain tried to convince me it was just the muffler backfiring, but it didn't sound mechanical. It sounded solid, fleshy almost, like a heavy sack of wet sand hitting the pavement. I rolled down my window just a crack to listen. The freezing air rushed in, whistling violently. Underneath the sound of the wind, the night was dead silent. I rolled the window back up. I pushed the car up to 70 miles per hour. I just wanted to get off this road. I kept my foot heavy on the pedal, watching the white lines blur together. The trees on the sides of the road looked identical, passing by in a continuous loop. It read 2:45 a.m., meaning I had been driving for 45 minutes. I should have been home by now. As I looked back up at the road, my headlights washed over a wooden structure on the shoulder. My breath caught in my throat. It was the billboard, again, for the third time. The collapsed corner, the rotting wood, it was exactly the same. Panic finally broke through my confusion. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt in the middle of the empty highway. My tires squealed and the car jerked before idling loudly in the silence. I just sat there, breathing heavily, staring out the windshield at the endless stretch of road. My hands were shaking. I grabbed my phone from the passenger seat to call for help, but when I looked at the screen, there was no service in the top corner. Not even one bar. I was completely cut off. I debated throwing the car into reverse. Maybe if I went backward, I could break whatever loop I was stuck in. But the thought of driving backward into that pitch-black darkness terrified me more than moving forward. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. I was just about to put the car back in drive when I heard it. Thud. It was so loud this time it vibrated through the frame of my car. It was right behind me, maybe 10 feet away. I froze, every muscle in my body locked up. I was too terrified to even look in the mirror. I sat absolutely paralyzed, my eyes fixed straight ahead. I expected to hear footsteps walking up to my trunk or maybe a knock on my back window, but there was nothing, just the low hum of my engine and my own frantic breathing. My mind raced through horrible possibilities. Someone had thrown something at my car, something had fallen from the trees. Or worse, someone was following me, keeping pace with my car in the dark. That thought alone sent a wave of nausea over me. How could anything keep up with a car going 70 miles per hour? I didn't wait to find out. I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun on the cold asphalt before finally gripping. I didn't care about the speed limit anymore. I pushed the needle past 80, then 90, flying blindly down the highway and praying I wouldn't veer off the road. The pine trees blurred into a solid wall of darkness on either side. I kept my eyes focused on the edge of my headlights, desperate to see anything familiar. A house, a turnoff, a street sign, anything. Then the sound changed. It was no longer a single, isolated thud every few miles. It became a rhythm. Thud, pause, thud, pause, thud. It was getting faster, and it was getting closer. Whatever was making that noise was gaining on me, no matter how fast I drove. It sounded heavy, like massive, wet footsteps slamming into the pavement right behind my rear bumper. I could almost feel the impact shivering through the floorboards. I was going 95 miles per hour. It was physically impossible, yet the sounds were there, undeniable and terrifyingly loud. I started screaming. I couldn't help it. I just yelled at the top of my lungs, trying to drown out the horrible, rhythmic thudding behind me. I began to smell something terrible seeping through the air vents. It smelled like old, rotting dirt and rust. It was suffocating. The thuds were so close now it felt like something was repeatedly ramming into my trunk. The entire back end of the car shuddered with every impact. I squeezed my eyes shut for a fraction of a second, praying for it to stop. When I opened them, the darkness ahead suddenly broke. A cluster of glowing yellow streetlights appeared in the distance. I didn't slow down. I flew toward the lights like a moth. As I crossed under the first streetlight, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere in the car vanished instantly. The smell of rotting dirt was gone. The rhythmic thudding behind me completely stopped. I hit the brakes, slowing the car down to a normal speed. I looked around wildly. I was entering the outskirts of my town. I recognized the old diner, the intersection, the familiar storefronts. Everything was normal. I glanced down at my dashboard. The clock read 3:15 a.m. and time was moving again. I didn't stop until I pulled into my apartment parking lot. I parked right under the brightest security light. I turned off the engine but couldn't bring myself to get out. I just sat there for 20 minutes, staring into the rearview mirror. Eventually, the freezing temperature forced me to move. I grabbed my keys and slowly opened the door. Before going inside, I felt a terrible urge to check the back of my car. I walked around to the trunk, my heart pounding in my throat. Under the harsh yellow glow of the light, I saw them. The entire back bumper and trunk were covered in thick, dark mud. It wasn't just splattered. The mud was caked on in large, distinct shapes. They looked like massive, smeared handprints pressing down hard against the metal, as if something incredibly heavy had been holding onto my car, dragging itself right behind me for miles. I quit my job at the gas station the very next day. I never drove that stretch of highway again. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed and the house is completely quiet, I swear I can hear a faint, heavy thud coming from the street outside. Story 3. This happened during the cruise ship corridor. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. At least that was how I viewed my cabin after a month at sea. It felt like my own tiny house floating in the ocean. I was working my first contract on a luxury liner. The job was fun but exhausting, leaving me drained. It is easy to forget you are trapped miles away from solid land. But the ship changes completely when the passengers go to sleep. It was around 3:15 a.m. I had just finished breaking down a deck party. My muscles were screaming at me. All I wanted was to get back to my cabin and collapse. My room was on deck 2, strictly for crew members. To get there faster, I took a shortcut through deck 7. Deck 7 was a passenger deck. It was an endless stretch of identical cabin doors on both sides of a narrow hallway. Usually I avoided these decks to bypass drunk guests, but I was so tired that I just wanted the fastest route. I swiped my card and stepped into the corridor. The first thing I noticed was the absolute silence. During the day, these hallways are chaotic. You hear kids running and televisions blaring, but at 3:15 a.m. it was completely dead. The silence felt suffocating. The only sound was the deep vibration of the ship's engines humming far below. I started walking down the long hallway. The lighting was dimmed, casting faint shadows. The carpet had a repeating geometric pattern stretching forever. I kept my head down, putting one foot in front of the other. The doors were perfectly aligned, all painted dull cream. I had been walking for maybe 2 minutes when I heard it. It was a faint sound, a dull thud. I stopped walking. I stood still in the middle of the empty hallway and listened. The ship creaked slightly, but that was normal. The sound I heard was different. It did not sound like the ship settling. It sounded deliberate. I rubbed my eyes. I figured a passenger had dropped something in their sleep. I took a deep breath and started walking again. My footsteps were completely muffled by the carpet. I passed about 4 more doors, then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. It came from the door immediately to my right. Cabin 7142. I paused. It was not loud. It was a very soft, polite tapping, the kind used to gently wake someone up. I stared at the door, waiting to hear a voice. There was nothing, just the low hum of the engine. A strange unease settled in my stomach. Why would someone knock from the inside of their own cabin door? If they wanted to get out, they would just open it. I forced my legs to move, wanting to reach the end of this incredibly long hallway. I passed 2 more doors. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. The sound came from the door on my left this time. Cabin 7146. The tapping was identical, same rhythm, same pressure, 3 soft taps. My mouth felt dry. I looked back over my shoulder. It was completely empty. I looked forward again, just 2 rows of closed doors staring back at me. A cold chill crawled up my neck. I tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was an acoustic trick, but my rubber-soled shoes were silent on the carpet. I took a hesitant step forward. My eyes were glued to the doors. I took another step, then another. Knock, knock, knock. This time it came from the right, cabin 7150. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped dead. The knocking was following me. Every time I moved past a set of doors, the tapping sounded from the next cabin. It was physically impossible. There was no way a single person could move from room to room that fast. I felt a wave of vulnerability. Hundreds of people were sleeping just feet away, but I could not reach them. If I screamed that someone was knocking on the inside of their own doors, I would sound insane. I decided to test it to see if I was losing my mind. I took a breath and forced myself to walk forward with an even pace. Pass a door. Knock, knock, knock. Pass another door. Knock, knock, knock. Pass another. Knock, knock, knock. Panic welled up in my eyes. It was real. Something was tracking my movement down the hallway. They were walking alongside me, just on the other side of the walls. The worst part was the rhythm. It never changed. Always those same 3 gentle taps. It felt mocking. I started to feel physically sick. My hands trembled. I looked down the hallway. At least 50 cabins stood between me and the exit. I kept walking. If I stopped, something terrible would happen. My legs felt like lead, but fear forced me to keep moving. Knock, knock, knock. Knock, knock, knock. It was happening with every single step I took now. The sound bounced back and forth across the hallway. Left, right, left, right. It was deafening in the quiet night. I kept imagining the people inside the rooms. Were they awake? Were they hearing this too? Or were they completely oblivious to the nightmare outside their doors? Then I had a sudden, terrifying thought. What if it wasn't someone moving between the rooms? What if it was someone inside every single room? The thought was so horrifying that it actually made me stop. I planted my feet firmly on the carpet. I held my breath, terrified to make a sound. The hallway fell dead silent. The knocking stopped instantly. I stood there like a statue, my heart hammered against my ribs. I waited. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, a full minute passed. Nothing, just the deep hum of the engine. The silence confirmed my worst fear. Whatever was making that noise was reacting to me. It knew exactly where I was standing, and it was waiting for me to move again. I stared at the peephole on the door closest to me. I imagined an eye pressed up against the other side, watching me. The feeling of being observed was so intense it made my skin crawl. I felt entirely exposed. I slowly took a step backward. Nothing happened, no sound. I took another step backward. Still nothing. It only seemed to trigger when I moved forward, deeper into the hallway. I knew I could not stay there forever. I could turn around and walk all the way back, which felt like miles away, or I could make a run for the exit in front of me. I chose to run. I didn't care about waking up the passengers. I just wanted to get off that deck. I bolted. I sprinted down the hallway as fast as my tired legs could carry me. As soon as I started running, the knocking exploded around me. It was no longer a polite tapping. It was a chaotic, overlapping frenzy of sound. It sounded like dozens of people suddenly hammering their fists against the inside of their doors all at the same time. Bang, bang, bang. Every door I passed shook with the impact of the strikes. The sound was deafening, filling the narrow corridor with a terrifying roar of hollow wood. I didn't look left or right. I kept my eyes locked on the heavy fire doors at the end of the hall. I pushed myself harder. The hammering seemed to get louder and more violent the closer I got to the exit. It felt like the doors were going to splinter open at any second. I kept waiting for a hand to pull me into the darkness of one of those rooms. I hit the heavy metal handle of the stairwell door with my entire body weight. I crashed through it and tumbled into the brightly lit stairwell. I scrambled to my feet and pulled the door shut behind me with a loud slam. I collapsed against the railing, gasping for air. My body was shaking violently. I pressed my ear against the heavy fire door, listening for the sounds from the hallway. Silent. Absolute dead silence. No knocking, no bangings, nothing. I practically flew down the stairs to deck 2. I ran all the way to my crew cabin, locked the door, and pushed my heavy desk chair under the handle. I remember my hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries just to get the key card to scan properly in the reader. I crawled into my small bunk and pulled the thin blanket over my head, shivering despite the warmth of the room. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there in the dark, jumping at every minor creak. The next morning, I asked other crew members if there had been any complaints from Deck 7 overnight. I expected to hear that the guests were furious about a massive disturbance. But there was nothing, not a single noise complaint. Everyone on that deck had apparently slept soundly through the entire night. I finished my contract 2 months later. I never took a shortcut through a passenger deck again. Whenever I had to walk past rows of identical closed doors, I always felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I still don't know what was happening in that corridor. I don't know how that sound was made or why it followed me. But the scariest part isn't the knocking itself. It is the realization that behind closed doors, things are not always as empty as they seem. Sometimes something is waiting in the dark, just listening for your footsteps to pass by. Story 4. This happened on a cold school after field trip night. I thought the tapping on my window was just branches, but it was. My name is Kevin Walters, and at the time this took place, I was 17 years old. It was late November, right in the middle of my senior year of high school. My history class had taken a long day trip to a museum about 3 hours away from our hometown. By the time our yellow school bus finally pulled back into the sprawling, empty parking lot of our high school, it was already past 11:15 p.m. The ride back had been quiet. Most of us had slept, exhausted from walking around all day. When the bus air brakes hissed and the doors swung open, we all just wanted to go home and sleep in our own beds. I stumbled off the bus into the freezing wind. I pulled my jacket tighter around my chest and waved a lazy goodbye to a few of my friends. The parking lot was poorly lit, with only a few buzzing orange street lamps casting dim pools of light onto the cracked asphalt. I walked over to my car, an old beat-up sedan, and unlocked the door with shivering hands. I tossed my jacket onto the passenger seat and sat down heavily behind the steering wheel. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. The engine coughed a few times before finally settling into a steady hum. I just sat there for a few minutes, rubbing my hands in front of the vents, waiting for the warm air to start blowing. The parking lot emptied out quickly. Within 10 minutes, the other students had either driven off or been picked up by their parents. The tail lights of the school bus disappeared down the road, leaving me completely alone in the massive, dark lot. The school building loomed in front of me like a giant, silent shadow. That was when I heard the tapping. It was faint at first, just a light, rhythmic clicking sound against the glass of my passenger side window. I stopped rubbing my hands together and froze. I looked over expecting to see a friend playing a prank on me, but there was no one standing there. The area right outside the window was completely empty. I looked up at the sky, thinking maybe it was starting to hail or rain, but the night was clear. There were no trees planted anywhere near this section of the lot, no branches to blow in the wind, just empty space. I stared at the glass for a long time. The tapping had stopped as soon as I looked over. I convinced myself it was just the engine cooling down or some random piece of debris blowing across the asphalt and hitting the car. I shook my head, feeling a little bit stupid for getting so spooked. I reached over to the passenger seat to grab my phone from my backpack. My hand hit empty fabric. I looked down. My jacket was there, but my heavy black backpack was completely missing. A sinking feeling hit my stomach. I realized exactly where it was. When we had first gathered at the school earlier that morning, we had all piled our bags in the gymnasium bleachers before boarding the buses. I had been so tired getting off the bus just now that I walked straight to my car without even thinking about going inside to get my bag. I groaned out loud and leaned my head back against the headrest. I really did not want to go back into that massive, dark building, but my house keys were in the front pocket of that backpack. If I drove home now, I would be locked out, and my parents would be furious if I woke them up at almost midnight to let me in. I had no choice. I turned off the engine, plunging the inside of the car into silence. I grabbed my phone, opened the car door, and stepped back out into the bitter cold. The wind seemed to have picked up, howling softly across the empty parking lot. I walked slowly toward the side entrance of the school. Normally, the doors automatically lock after hours, but I knew that sometimes the evening janitorial staff would prop the heavy metal doors open with a rock or a piece of wood while they took the trash out to the dumpsters out back. I just had to hope someone was still working. As I got closer, the massive brick building looked incredibly intimidating. During the day, it was loud, bright, and full of life. Now, it just looked dead. I reached the side doors and pulled on the first metal handle. It didn't budge. I tried the second one, locked tight. I moved down the line of doors to the very last one. I pulled, and to my massive relief, it clicked and swung open heavily. The custodian must have forgotten to properly latch it from the inside. I stepped through the doorway and let the heavy door swing shut behind me. It closed with a loud, echoing boom that made me jump. The sound traveled far down the empty hallway, bouncing off the metal lockers until it finally faded into silence. I stood perfectly still for a moment, just listening. The silence was absolute. It felt heavy, almost suffocating. The air inside the school was warm and smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. The main overhead lights were completely shut off. The only illumination came from the emergency lights spaced far apart on the ceiling. They cast a sickly, dim yellowish glow that barely reached the floor. Long, stretched-out shadows filled the corners of the hallway. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The bright white beam cut through the gloom, revealing the familiar row of blue lockers stretching down the corridor. I took a deep breath and started walking. My sneakers squeaked loudly against the polished linoleum floor. Every step I took seemed incredibly loud. Squeak, squeak, squeak. I tried to walk softer, rolling my feet from heel to toe, but the silence of the building just amplified every tiny noise I made. I felt completely out of place. Being in a school in the middle of the night feels wrong. It feels like you are trespassing in a place you are not supposed to see when it is resting. I turned the corner, heading toward the main gymnasium. The hallways seemed much longer in the dark. The doors to the dark classrooms looked like black, empty mouths waiting on either side of me. As I walked, I passed the old drinking fountains near the cafeteria. I remembered a loose metal panel on one of the lockers right across from it that always clanked loudly whenever someone slammed the door next to it. It was a stupid, normal detail, but thinking about everyday school life made me feel a little bit less nervous. I kept my phone light pointed straight ahead, not wanting to look into the dark classrooms as I passed them. I finally reached the double doors of the gymnasium. I pushed them open and stepped inside. The gym was massive and the ceiling was lost in complete darkness. The smell of old wood and rubber mats was strong in here. I shined my light across the wooden floor, moving the beam until it hit the metal bleachers pulled out on the far side of the room. Sure enough, sitting right there on the third row was my black backpack. I let out a long breath of relief. I walked quickly across the gym floor, grabbed the bag by the top strap, and slung it over my shoulder. It felt heavy and comforting. I patted the front pocket, feeling the hard metal shape of my house keys inside. Mission accomplished. I turned around and headed back out the double doors, eager to get back to the safety of my car. I retraced my steps, walking back down the long hallway past the cafeteria. I felt much better now. The fear was fading, replaced by just wanting to get home and climb into bed. I reached the intersection where the hallway split. If I went straight, I would reach the side doors I came in through. But just as I was about to walk forward, I stopped dead in my tracks. I heard something. I stood perfectly frozen, holding my breath, straining my ears to listen. It was incredibly faint, coming from down the left hallway, the hallway that led toward the science labs. It sounded like people talking. It wasn't just one voice. It sounded like a room full of people having quiet conversations, like a classroom full of students whispering to each other before the teacher walks in. It was a low, steady murmur of voices that echoed weirdly in the dark corridor. My mind instantly tried to make sense of it. Maybe the janitors were taking a break in one of the science rooms and had a radio playing. Or maybe a teacher had stayed incredibly late to grade papers and was listening to a podcast, but it was almost midnight. That made no sense, and the voices didn't sound like a radio or a TV. They sounded hollow. They sounded flat. There was no emotion in the murmurs, no distinct words that I could pick out, just a continuous, overlapping buzz of talking. Curiosity completely took over my common sense. I shouldn't have done it, but I slowly turned my body and started walking down the left hallway toward the sound. I moved as quietly as I possibly could. I kept my phone flashlight pointed at the floor so I wouldn't announce my presence. The murmuring voices grew slightly louder with every few steps I took. They were definitely coming from the very last classroom at the end of the hall, room 212, the biology lab. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My palms were sweating so much I was worried I might drop my phone. The closer I got, the more wrong the voices sounded. Real humans do not talk like that. The packing was off. There were no natural pauses for breath, no laughter, no sudden changes in volume. It was just a drone of whispered, empty conversations. I felt a cold chill wash over my entire body. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and run back to the car, but I just had to know. I had to see what was making that noise. I finally reached the door of room 212. The door was slightly ajar, maybe open just an inch or two. The murmuring was very clear now, coming from directly inside the dark room. I stood outside the door for what felt like an eternity. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. My hand was shaking violently. I slowly raised my hand, placing my fingertips flat against the cold wood of the door. I took a shallow, shaky breath. I gently pushed the door open just a few more inches to peek inside. The second the hinges let out a tiny, almost silent squeak, the voices stopped. They didn't trail off, they didn't quiet down, they stopped instantly, all at the exact same millisecond. It was as if someone had just pulled the plug on a speaker. The sudden, absolute silence that slammed into the hallway was deafening. It hit me like a physical weight. I stood there, staring into the pitch-black classroom, too terrified to even move my flashlight up to look around. My blood ran completely cold. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. I stood frozen, staring into the dark, and then I felt it. It was a feeling so intense and so deeply wrong that my mind could barely process it. The air directly behind my back suddenly felt freezing cold. Every single hair on the back of my neck and my arms stood straight up. The space behind me no longer felt empty. I could feel the heavy, oppressive weight of someone or something standing right there, right behind me. It was so close I imagined I could feel the space it took up. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My body completely locked up in pure, unadulterated terror. The silence in the hallway was so thick it was making my ears ring. And then, right beside my left ear, just inches away from my skin, I heard it. A slow, wet, deliberate intake of breath. It was a raspy, jagged sound. It did not sound human. It sounded like something pulling air into lungs that hadn't been used in a very long time. The spell of terror broke. Adrenaline violently exploded through my veins. I didn't even look over my shoulder. I just spun around blindly, nearly tripping over my own feet, and started running. I sprinted back down the hallway faster than I had ever run in my entire life. My phone slipped from my sweaty grip and shattered loudly on the linoleum floor behind me, plunging me into near total darkness. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The only light came from the dim emergency bulbs overhead. I hit the intersection and took a sharp right, my shoes sliding on the polished floor. I threw all my body weight against the heavy metal side doors. They crashed open and I tumbled out into the freezing night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I practically tore the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed the lock button. I jammed the key in, started the engine, threw it into drive, and sped out of the parking lot without even turning my headlights on until I hit the main road. I never went back to get my phone. I told my parents I lost it on the field trip. I never stayed at that school past 3 p.m. ever again. I still don't know what I heard murmuring in that dark classroom or what was standing directly behind me in the hallway. But the scariest part is the simple realization that stays with me every single night. Whatever it was, it didn't chase me when I ran, just let me leave, which means it's probably still standing there in the dark, waiting for the next time someone comes back alone. Story 5. During my first few months living in the old brick high-rise on 4th Street, I was staying in a basement apartment. At first, the noises upstairs seemed normal, until I realized they weren't coming from upstairs. They were coming from the elevator shaft directly behind my bedroom wall. My name is Ashley. At the time, I was 22 and trying to make ends meet in a new city. The apartment was cheap, mostly because it felt more like a utility closet than a living space. There were thick, exposed pipes running across the entire length of the ceiling. The only window was a tiny rectangle of thick, frosted glass near the top of the wall that looked out onto an alleyway at ground level. But the most prominent feature was the noise. The elevator was a massive, clunky metal box that groaned and shuddered every time it moved. Because my unit shared a wall with the bottom of the shaft, I could hear everything. I could hear the thick steel cables dragging. I could hear the heavy thud when the car hit the ground floor. It eventually just became background noise to me. I worked a late shift doing data entry for a logistics company, so my schedule was completely backwards. I usually didn't get off work until 2 a.m., which meant my commute home consisted of empty subway cars and dark, quiet streets. By the time I finally reached my building, I was always physically exhausted. The only thing on my mind was getting through the cold lobby, taking the elevator down one floor, and passing out in my bed. It was a Tuesday night, well, technically Wednesday morning. I walked through the double glass doors of the lobby right around 2:45 a.m. The building was completely silent, which wasn't unusual for that time of night. The lobby was dimly lit, illuminated mostly by a vending machine in the corner with a flickering fluorescent light. That flickering light always gave the room a weird, sterile feeling. I walked over to the elevator bay and pressed the down button. I stood there listening to the familiar sounds behind the wall, the heavy metallic clatter, the screech of old brakes. The digital display above the doors showed the car was coming down from the 8th floor. It felt slower than usual, but I was so tired I didn't care. I just wanted to sleep. When it finally reached the lobby, the doors slid open with a sluggish scrape. I stepped inside. The elevator car itself was small, lined with scratched fake wood paneling and smelling faintly of industrial grease and stale air. I pressed the button with the letter B on it for the basement. The doors shuttered and closed, sealing me inside. I leaned against the back wall and closed my eyes, waiting for the familiar stomach drop sensation of heading downward. But that didn't happen. Instead of going down to the basement, there was a harsh, jarring jolt that actually made me stumble forward a little. The elevator didn't drop, it started going up. I frowned, looking up at the digital display. It changed from the lobby to floor 2, then to 3. I immediately started pressing the basement button again, thinking maybe the system just didn't register my floor. But the button didn't light up. I tried the lobby button. Nothing. I tried the button for the doors to open. It was completely dead. Panic hadn't set in yet. Honestly, I was just annoyed. I figured the ancient electrical system had finally short-circuited. Or maybe someone on a higher floor had called the elevator right before I pressed my button, and the outdated machine had prioritized their request. It was annoying to be delayed when I was this tired, but it wasn't terrifying. I leaned my head against the cool metal wall and waited. The car continued to rise, 4, 5. Finally, it stopped on the 6th floor. There was another heavy metallic clank and the doors slowly slid open. I stood near the back, expecting to see a tired neighbor waiting to get in, but there was no one there. That wasn't the weird part, though. The weird part was the hallway. It was completely pitch black. The hallways in this building operated on motion sensor lights to save electricity. Usually, the moment the elevator doors opened, the sensors would catch the movement, and the overhead fluorescent lights would snap on with a loud buzzing sound. But nothing happened. The doors were wide open, revealing a thick, suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow the dim light from inside the elevator car. I didn't step out. I just stood there, staring into the dark. "Hello," I called out softly. My voice sounded weak, quickly absorbed by the dead silence of the 6th floor. No one answered. There was no sound of a door closing, no footsteps walking down the carpeted hall, just an unnatural, heavy quiet. A sudden chill washed over me, a deep sense of unease that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I desperately smashed the lobby button, then the basement button. "Come on," I whispered to myself, "just close." After what felt like an eternity, the doors finally scraped shut. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I watched the display, expecting to see the numbers go down, 6, 5, 4, but they didn't. The elevator jerked upward again, 7, 8. My heart started beating faster. Something was really wrong. The control panel wasn't responding at all. I was completely at the mercy of this old metal box. It stopped on the 9th floor. The doors groaned and opened once again. Just like the 6th floor, it was a wall of complete darkness. The motion sensors were dead here too. I pressed myself against the rear wall of the elevator, my breathing becoming shallow and quick. I stared out into the void of the 9th floor hallway. It felt different this time. Before, it was just dark and empty. But now, the air pouring into the elevator felt freezing cold, and I had this sudden, overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. I don't know how to explain it. It was just a primal instinct, warning me not to move, not to make a sound. I kept mashing the door close button behind my back, my fingers trembling. Then I heard it out in the dark. It was incredibly faint at first, so quiet I almost convinced myself it was just the rustling of my own clothes. But as the seconds ticked by, the sound became clearer. It was breathing, heavy, wet breathing. Someone was standing out there in the pitch-black hallway. The sound was rhythmic and slow. Inhale, exhale. It didn't sound like someone who had just run up the stairs. It sounded deliberate. It sounded like someone just standing there in the dark, waiting for me. I froze completely, my muscles locking up in absolute terror. My mouth went completely dry. My eyes strained against the lack of light, desperately trying to find a shape or a shadow hidden in the hallway. But the darkness was just too thick and completely impenetrable. The breathing seemed to be getting slightly louder. The person was moving closer to the open elevator doors. They weren't walking normally. There was a very subtle dragging sound on the carpet, accompanied by that slow, raspy breathing. It was terrifying. I wanted to scream, but my throat was completely tight. I just kept pressing the plastic button behind my back, praying for the doors to shut. The breathing was so close now, it felt like it was right at the threshold of the elevator. I could almost feel the cold air moving from their lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for someone to step into the dim light of the car. Suddenly, a loud mechanical buzz echoed through the elevator, making me jump violently. The doors finally started to close. I opened my eyes just in time to see the gap narrowing. And in that split second before the doors completely sealed, something blocked the light. It was just a fraction of a second, but I saw a shape lean forward into the path of the closing doors. The heavy metal doors slammed shut, cutting off the view and the sound of the breathing. The elevator immediately dropped. It didn't stop at the lobby. It bypassed the ground floor entirely and slammed to a halt in the basement. The doors flew open. I didn't wait. I sprinted out of the elevator, running down the short, brightly lit concrete hallway to my apartment door. My hands were shaking so violently, I dropped my keys twice before finally getting the deadbolt open. I practically threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me and locking every single lock. I backed away, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. I stood in the middle of my small living room, half expecting someone to start pounding on the wood, but nothing happened. It was quiet. I slowly walked over to my bed and sat down on the edge. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. It was 3:15 a.m. I tried to tell myself it was a prank, someone messing with the fuse box, a homeless person who had snuck inside. But none of those explanations made me feel any better. I just sat there in the silence, trying to calm down. Then I heard it, coming from the wall right behind my bed, the heavy, metallic clanking of the elevator cables. The car was moving. I listened as the motor hummed, the sound getting louder and louder. It was coming down. The heavy thud shook the wall as the elevator arrived at the basement level. The doors scraped open. I held my breath. And then, from the hallway right outside my apartment door, I heard that same heavy, wet breathing. Story 6. Around the time we found that abandoned classroom desk, I started getting strange notifications from my security camera. The weird part was, the camera wasn't even plugged in. It was an old plastic thing I kept on my windowsill. I had thrown it into a drawer months ago because the cable snapped. It had no power source. Yet there I was in the middle of the night, staring at my glowing phone screen. The alert flashed clearly, saying motion had been detected. I sat there in the dark, my heart pounding in my chest. To fully understand why that terrified me, I have to explain what happened earlier that exact same night. I am 22 years old, living in a quiet part of Pennsylvania. My friends and I spent most weekends just driving around empty roads. My two best friends, Mark and Chris, loved urban exploration. They enjoyed finding forgotten places like old factories and walking around inside them. I usually tagged along for the thrill, though I was always the most cautious one. We had explored a few places before, but nothing too crazy. Just empty buildings with some graffiti. But that Friday night, Mark suggested we check out the old county high school. The school had been completely shut down since 1998. It sat at the very edge of town, tucked away behind dying trees and a rusting chain-link fence. Over time, it became a massive, rotting landmark. Kids spread rumors about the place, but I never believed them. I just thought it was a creepy-looking building. So around 11:15 p.m., we drove out there. We parked half a mile down the road at an empty gas station so nobody would see our vehicle. The walk to the school was freezing. It was late November, and the night air felt sharp and biting. There were no streetlights on that stretch of road. As we got closer, the massive silhouette of the school loomed over the dead trees. It looked like a dark fortress. The windows were all smashed out, looking like empty black holes in the brick walls. The wind howled through the broken glass, creating a low, whistling sound that made my skin crawl. I remember stopping and staring at the building. A heavy knot formed in my stomach. Something about the place felt fundamentally wrong. It didn't feel peacefully empty, it felt hollow. I almost told the guys I wanted to turn back. My instincts were screaming at me to walk away, but I didn't want to look like a coward, so I kept my mouth shut and followed them. We found a spot where the heavy chain link was pulled back, creating a gap just big enough to squeeze through. Once we were on the school grounds, the frosted grass crunched loudly under our heavy boots. We walked around to the back of the building, checking the boarded-up windows. Chris found a heavy metal door near the old cafeteria that had been propped open with a cracked cinder block. We clicked on our flashlights and stepped into the pitch-black hallway. The smell hit me immediately. It was a suffocating mix of wet mold, rotting wood, and decades of dust. It smelled like a place that had not breathed in a very long time. The bright beams of our flashlights cut through the thick darkness, illuminating faded blue lockers and scattered debris covering the cracked linoleum floor. We walked slowly down the main corridor, speaking in hushed whispers. The echo in that cavernous place was insane. Even the slight scuff of our shoes bounced off the peeling walls and faded into the dark corridors ahead. We explored the empty first floor for about 20 minutes. We saw the old gymnasium, which was just a massive, intimidating cavern of shadows with a partially collapsed roof. Nothing seemed too out of the ordinary for an abandoned building. Mark pointed his flashlight toward the main stairwell and suggested we head up to the second floor. I really did not want to go further into the decaying building. The second floor had far fewer windows to let in the moonlight. It was completely engulfed in total, suffocating darkness. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, trying to think of an excuse to stay behind, but Mark and Chris were already walking up the concrete steps, so I nervously hurried to catch up with them. The concrete stairs were littered with broken glass and old, waterlogged papers. When we reached the top landing, the entire atmosphere felt noticeably different. It was significantly colder up there, almost freezing. My breath instantly started plumbing into visible white clouds in front of my flashlight beam. The main hallway stretched out endlessly in both directions, looking like a dark tunnel. It was lined with heavy, solid wooden classroom doors. Many of them were hanging diagonally off their rusted hinges, while others were completely missing, leaving dark, open doorways. We started walking closely together down the right side of the hallway, checking out the old lockers. Suddenly we heard a loud, violent bang coming from the exact opposite end of the floor. It sounded exactly like a heavy wooden door being slammed shut with incredible force. We all completely froze in our tracks. Chris whispered that it was probably just the wind blowing through a broken window. It made sense logically, but it didn't make me feel any better. Mark immediately wanted to go check it out. I grabbed his arm and told him he was crazy, begging him to just turn around so we could leave. But he laughed it off and started quietly jogging down the opposite end of the dark hallway. Chris hesitated for a second, then followed him, quietly telling me to just wait right there for a minute while they checked the far classrooms. Within moments, their bouncing flashlight beams faded around a distant corner, and the echo of their footsteps completely disappeared. I was left standing completely alone in the freezing, dark corridor. I stood perfectly still, pointing my flashlight down the empty hall. The silence was absolute. After a few agonizing minutes passed, I started feeling extremely exposed. I felt like something was watching me from the shadows. I decided to step into the nearest open classroom to wait for them, just so I could get my back against a solid wall. I took a deep breath and slowly walked through the open doorway of room 214. It was an old science classroom. The long, heavy black lab tables were still firmly bolted to the floor, but most of the metal chairs were scattered haphazardly around the room. The air in this specific room felt terribly stagnant and wrong. It felt exactly like stepping into a meat freezer. I walked over to the far corner of the room, keeping my light on the doorway, and leaned against the cold brick wall. I pulled out my phone, hopping to text Mark to hurry up. It was exactly 12:45 a.m. I had 0 bars of cell service. I sighed heavily, feeling a sudden wave of frustration. My flashlight beam was starting to flicker slightly, so I clicked it off for just a few seconds to save the battery. The absolute blackness was overwhelming. The silence was so deep it made my ears ring. Panic set in quickly, and I immediately clicked the light back on. When the bright yellow beam illuminated the classroom again, my heart physically stopped in my chest. One of the heavy desk chairs in the middle of the room was in a completely different spot. I stared at it unblinking, my terrified mind racing to process what I was seeing. It was a standard, rusted metal chair with 4 small black wheels on the bottom. Right before I had turned my light off, that specific chair had been pushed awkwardly against a lab table. Now it was sitting dead center in the middle aisle. It was pulled out into the open, facing directly toward me. I desperately told myself I was just losing my mind. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I kept the flashlight beam focused steadily on the empty metal chair. Then the impossible happened right in front of me. The chair began to move. It rolled perfectly smoothly across the dusty linoleum floor, moving directly and purposefully toward where I was standing trapped in the corner. The small plastic wheels made a dry, horrible scraping sound that echoed loudly in the silent room. I completely froze, trapped in a state of absolute disbelief. The chair rolled about 5 feet toward me before slowly coming to a halt. The scraping sound stopped, leaving behind an unbearable, ringing silence. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't move a single muscle. I stood glued to the wall, gripping my flashlight. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was just a prank by Mark and Chris, but they were gone. I took one slow, trembling step backward, heading toward the classroom door. As soon as my foot shifted, a horrific noise erupted. It was the collective sound of metal scraping against linoleum. I shined my flashlight across the room in pure panic. Every single chair in the entire classroom was shifting at the exact same time. They were all slowly turning, pointing directly at me. I didn't think, I just ran. I sprinted blindly out of the building, screaming for my friends. We drove away in total silence. We never spoke about that room again. But earlier tonight, when my dead security camera sent that alert, I opened the notification. It wasn't a live view of my bedroom. The unplugged camera had sent a single, static image. It was a picture of my empty bedroom, but sitting right in the center of the floor was one rusted metal desk chair. Story 7. This happened while I was house-sitting for my aunt at the late-night car repair shop. The creaking floors didn't bother me until they started following me. My aunt owned a massive commercial auto body building on the outskirts of our town. It was a huge cinder-block structure with 5 deep garage bays on the ground floor. She lived in a converted loft apartment built directly above the main garage. While she was out of state, she let me use the professional lifts after hours to work on my sedan in exchange for keeping an eye on the property. It was a cold Tuesday night in late October. The constant, heavy rain beating against the metal roof made me feel completely cut off from the rest of the world. The layout of the shop always gave me a weird feeling at night. I pulled my car into Bay 1 and positioned the arms of the hydraulic lift. The hydraulic pump whined loudly as my car went up into the air. Bright fluorescent tubes lit up the areas directly beneath them, but the rest of the empty shop was swallowed in deep, heavy shadows. I rolled over a heavy, rusted red tool cart to use as my main workstation. It was solid metal and weighed a ton. I had this one specific vintage torque wrench with a cracked black handle. It was solid steel. Whenever I set it down on the bare metal of the cart, it made a very distinct, hollow, scraping noise, a heavy drag of metal on metal. I slid underneath my car on a plastic creeper. Being under a suspended vehicle in an empty warehouse makes you feel incredibly vulnerable. It was around 11:45 p.m. I turned my music off. The silence suddenly felt overwhelming. That was my first mistake. Almost immediately, I heard a sound from down at the far end of the building, in Bay 5. It sounded like a handful of loose metal bolts being tossed onto the concrete floor. I lowered my flashlight and just listened. I held my breath, waiting for another sound. Nothing happened. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was just the old building settling. I forced myself to go back to work. I tried to focus, but something felt slightly off. The shadows stretching across the floor outside my bay seemed deeper now. I kept glancing out from under the car, checking the empty spaces between the lifts. About 10 minutes later, the noise happened again. This time it was much more deliberate. It was the heavy, solid sound of a large tool being dropped onto the floor with a loud clunk, and it was closer. It sounded like it came from bay 3, 2 bays down. I wiped the grease off my hands. I pushed myself out from under the car and stood up slowly in the middle of the quiet shop. The air felt colder outside of the car's shadow. I called out into the darkness. Nobody answered. I grabbed my heavy flashlight and started walking slowly toward bay 3. Every step I took seemed incredibly loud. I swept the beam of my flashlight back and forth, checking behind the rusted toolboxes. There were no tools lying on the floor. I walked back toward the center of the shop, feeling completely exposed. That was when I noticed the floorboards. The wooden floors up in my aunt's loft were incredibly old. You could hear every single shift of weight from down here. I stood perfectly still, listening. A faint creak came from the ceiling directly above my head. I took 3 slow steps backward, retreating toward my car. The creaking above me moved 3 steps in the exact same direction. Stop, pause, I moved left. The creaking shifted left. My heart started hammering against my ribs. Someone was upstairs in my aunt's apartment, in the dark. And whoever it was, they were tracking my movements through the floorboards, just following me from above. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I crept over to the office door to check the stairwell. I reached the door to the stairs, grabbed the handle, and slowly pulled it open. Total darkness greeted me. I didn't turn on the light. I just stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened. Absolute silence from up there now. Whoever had been walking had stopped completely. I was absolutely not going up there. I quietly backed out of the stairwell, pulled the door shut, and engaged the heavy deadbolt from the garage side. I just wanted to pack up, lower my car, and get out of there. The whole atmosphere of the building had changed. I walked quickly back to Bay 1, constantly looking over my shoulder. I expected to see someone standing in the shadows behind me. I reached the side of my car and went to grab my rag off the red tool cart. My hand grasped empty air. I looked down. The red tool cart wasn't there. I completely froze. It was completely gone. I stepped back and shined my flashlight around frantically. The beam cut through the darkness toward the back of the bay. I found it. It had been pushed almost 20 feet away, shoved deep into the darkest corner near the massive rolling garage door. A wave of pure terror washed over me. The concrete was perfectly level and the cart weighed almost 200 pounds with locking casters. It could not roll on its own. It was physically impossible. Someone was down here on the shop floor with me. Someone had quietly moved it while I was over by the office checking the stairwell. I abandoned my tools and my car. I just wanted my keys. They were sitting on a workbench 15 feet away. I slowly turned my back to the dark corner where the cart was sitting. I started walking toward the workbench, taking 2 shaky steps forward. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run entirely cold. It was coming from directly behind my back. I heard the slow, heavy, unmistakable sound of my custom torque wrench being dragged across the bare metal top of the tool cart. It was a harsh, grinding scrape of metal on metal. I stopped breathing. Every single muscle in my body locked up tight. I couldn't move a single inch. The cart was supposed to be 20 feet away. Something had pushed that heavy metal cart up silently the second I turned away. I stood frozen. I didn't turn around. I knew if I turned around, I would see something I could never unsee. Then I heard another sound, a faint, wet exhalation of air. It didn't sound like a person breathing. It sounded ragged, hollow, and terribly wrong. Just a slow, deliberate intake of air right behind my neck. My primal instincts completely took over. I didn't think, I just reacted. I lunged forward with everything I had. I practically threw myself at the workbench and grabbed my keys, violently knocking a dozen small tools onto the floor. The breathing stopped. I didn't look back. I sprinted wildly, my boots slipping on the concrete. I slammed my shoulder hard into the door's crash bar. It stuck tight for a terrifying second, refusing to open. Panic gripped my throat. I shoved it again, screaming out in fear, and the heavy door finally gave way. I burst out into the freezing, pouring rain. I ran blindly through the freezing rain toward my aunt's spare truck. I fumbled frantically with the keys. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped them in the mud. I scooped them up, jammed the key into the lock, and ripped the door open. I threw myself inside and locked all the doors instantly. I sat there in the dark cab, gasping for air, staring back at the side of the building. The single security light outside illuminated the frosted glass of the side door I had just run through. I watched the glass. Slowly, a massive shadow shifted against the frosted pane. It just stood there, completely blocking the dim light from inside the shop. It was too tall to be a normal person. It didn't move. It just watched me. I slammed the truck into drive and tore out of the parking lot. I spent the rest of the night parked at an open gas station, too terrified to sleep. I didn't go back until the next morning, well after the sun was fully up. I brought a friend with me. The heavy side door was still slightly cracked open from my escape. We walked inside together. The massive building was completely empty. The stairwell leading to the loft was still dead-bolted from the outside. But what truly made me sick to my stomach was my red tool cart. It wasn't in the dark corner anymore. It was parked perfectly center in Bay 1 directly beneath my suspended car, and resting right in the middle of the cart's top tray, completely clean of all grease and dirt, was my heavy black torque wrench. I never finished fixing my car there, and I never stayed overnight in that building again. Whatever was in there wasn't trying to scare me away. It was just watching me work. Story 8. I used to take late-night walks during my first summer stationed at the remote Firewatch Tower. One night, I realized someone else had been walking the exact same route as me for weeks. My name is Olivia. I was 22 and had just taken a job with the Forestry Service to get away from the noise of the city. I was assigned to Tower 4, located at the peak of a heavily wooded ridge in the Pacific Northwest. The tower was a small, square cabin with glass windows on all four sides, sitting on wooden stilts 60 feet in the air. You had to climb a zigzagging set of metal and wood stairs to reach it. A metal catwalk circled the outside, and a heavy wooden trapdoor in the floor was the only way in or out. During the day, I loved the quiet, but nights were different. The forest turned into a pitch-black ocean. The glass walls, so open during the day, felt like a display case. If my lantern was on, I couldn't see out, but anything out there could see me perfectly. Because of that claustrophobic feeling, I developed a habit. Every night around 11:30 p.m., I would climb down the stairs and take a walk along a narrow dirt trail circling the base. I would carry a heavy flashlight, enjoying the cool air. I walked the exact same loop every single night. Down the stairs, 50 yards out to a large boulder, around a cluster of pine trees, and back. Then things started feeling slightly off. It began with a subtle unease during those walks. You know that prickling feeling on the back of your neck when someone is watching you? I started getting it every time I reached the boulder. I would shine my flashlight into the trees and listen. There was never anything there. I told myself I was getting paranoid, but a few days later I found something. It was a Tuesday morning. The ground was soft from a light rain. As I walked my nightly route, I looked down at the mud. I saw my own boot prints, but right next to them, pressing deep into the soft earth, was another set of footprints. They were much larger than my boots, and they were fresh. My stomach dropped. I followed the prints with my eyes. They perfectly shadowed my route. They went out to the boulder, stopped where I always stopped, and followed the trail back toward the tower. But they didn't lead up the stairs. Instead, they veered off into the dark brush. Someone had been walking right behind me in the dark for weeks. I immediately canceled my late-night walks. I decided I wasn't going to leave the cabin after sunset ever again. The next few nights were tense. I made sure the trapdoor was bolted shut before dark. I kept my lantern turned down low. The silence of the forest now felt like it was hiding something. Every time the wind blew, the wooden frame groaned. The bottom flight of stairs had a loose metal bracket. Whenever you stepped on the first few stairs, that bracket would grind against the wood with a sharp clink. It became my early warning system. For a week, nothing happened. I started to convince myself the footprints belonged to a lost hiker. Then came a Thursday night. It was unseasonably cold, and a thick fog had rolled into the valley. It was around 1:30 a.m. I was wrapped in a blanket, staring at the ceiling. The wind was completely dead. It was a suffocating kind of quiet. I sat up to get a drink of water. I naturally glanced out the window facing the south side of the clearing. That was the side with the boulder. Standing right next to the boulder, perfectly still, was a figure. It was too far away to make out facial features, but it was clearly a person. They were tall, wearing dark clothing. The moonlight caught the pale skin of their face, making it look almost like a smooth, blank mask. Even from 60 feet up, I could tell they were looking directly at me. My body went numb. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there in the dark cabin, staring down. Maybe it's a camper, but no one goes hiking in a remote forestry area at almost 2 a.m. If they needed help, they would be calling out. They were just standing there, staring. I slowly lowered myself to the floor, crawling over to the radio on my desk. My hands were shaking. "Dispatch, this is Tower 4. Do you copy?" I waited. The radio hissed with quiet static. "Dispatch, this is Tower 4. I have an unauthorized person in my sector." Nothing. The atmospheric interference from the fog must have been blocking the signal. I was completely alone. I crawled back to the window and peeked over the frame. The figure was still there. They hadn't moved an inch. Their arms hung limply at their sides. I watched them and they watched me. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then an hour. The sheer psychological torture of it was unbearable. Every single survival instinct I had was screaming at me to just hide under my cot and close my eyes. I was terrified that if I lost sight of them, they would disappear into the trees and I wouldn't know where they were. The fog was drifting in slow ribbons, sometimes obscuring the figure for a few seconds before revealing them again. It was now approaching 3:15 a.m. My legs were cramping. The temperature had dropped and I was shivering from the cold and the adrenaline. I decided I needed my heavy flashlight. If I shined a blinding light down on them, it might scare them off. I took a deep breath, pulled my eyes away from the window, and scurried across the room. I grabbed the flashlight, feeling a tiny surge of confidence. I crawled back to the window. I gripped the flashlight tightly, ready to flip the switch. I looked over the edge. The clearing was empty. The figure was gone. My heart slammed against my ribs. I frantically scanned the tree line, pressing my face as close to the glass as I dared. Nothing. The forest was still. Where did they go? Did they walk back into the woods? I strained my ears to listen for snapping twigs. The silence was absolute. Then I heard it. Clang. A sharp metallic sound echoing from directly beneath me. It was the loose bracket on the bottom flight of stairs. The air left my lungs. They weren't in the woods. They were at the base of the tower. I froze, completely paralyzed by fear. Creak pause, creak pause. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, climbing the wooden stairs. They were taking their time. There was no rush, just a slow, methodical ascent. Every step sent a vibration up through the stilts. I could feel them coming closer, 10 feet up, 20 feet up. I scrambled backward, dragging myself into the dead center of the room. I kept my eyes locked on the trapdoor out on the catwalk. It was bolted shut, but the lock was old. 30 feet up. I clutched the heavy flashlight like a weapon. I was trapped in a glass box in the sky, and something was slowly making its way up to get me. 40 feet up, the steps were getting louder. The wood groaned. 50 feet up, they were on the final zigzag section, only a few yards below the catwalk. I couldn't handle the anticipation anymore. I slowly stood up, backing away until my shoulders pressed against the far glass wall. There was nowhere left to hide. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. They stepped off the wood and onto the metal grating of the catwalk. Clang, clang, clang. The sound of heavy boots walking along the metal walkway circled the outside of the cabin. The figure was walking around the perimeter, just out of my sight. The heavy footsteps stopped. They were standing directly over the wooden trapdoor. I held my breath, waiting for the sound of them rattling the lock. I raised the flashlight. But nothing happened. There was no pounding, no pulling on the handle, just total, agonizing silence. I stood pressed against the glass for what felt like an eternity. The first faint gray light of dawn eventually began to bleed into the sky, revealing the trapdoor outside. The metal grating of the catwalk was completely empty. I didn't hear them climb down. They simply weren't there anymore. I didn't leave the tower that morning. I sat by the radio, terrified, until the weather cleared and I managed to reach dispatch in the late afternoon. I told them I was sick, that I needed to come down immediately. I didn't mention the figure. I knew they wouldn't believe me. When the relief worker drove up the logging road the next day, I packed my bags faster than I ever have in my life. As I descended the 60 feet of stairs for the final time, the sunlight made the forest look normal again. The birds were singing. But when I reached the metal catwalk over the trapdoor, I stopped. Right there, carved deeply into the thick wood of the trapdoor frame, was a single, long scratch mark. It looked like it had been made by something incredibly sharp, dragging slowly across the grain. It hadn't been there the day before. I never figured out who it was or what they wanted. I never went back to that tower. I quit the forestry service entirely. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I find myself holding my breath. I listen to the silence, half expecting to hear the slow clink of metal and the sound of heavy footsteps climbing in the dark. Story 9. My roommate traveled a lot for work around finals week, so when I heard him talking in his room at 3 a.m., I knew something was wrong. He wasn't home. I was a junior at a state university. My off-campus apartment was usually quiet, but that night the voice I heard through his bedroom wall wasn't a television. It was a low, rhythmic muttering, like a breathless sermon. I stood in the dark hallway for an hour before my survival instinct kicked in. I didn't open his door. I grabbed my keys and walked out into the freezing November air. Refusing to stay there alone, I drove to the main campus library. It was open 24 hours during midterms, serving as a safe haven. Bright lights, guards, stressed-out kids cramming until dawn. Exactly what I needed to calm my shattered nerves. When I parked next to the library, my hands were still shaking. The dashboard clock read 3:45 a.m. The campus was dead. I hurried across the quad, pulling my jacket tight against the wind, and pushed through the heavy glass lobby doors. The blast of warm air was comforting. The faint hum of the heating felt like a blanket, but the lobby was strangely empty. The front desk was vacant. The main security podium was abandoned, though a coffee cup sat next to the sign-in sheet. I figured the guard was doing rounds. Needing quiet, I bypassed the elevator and took the stairs to the 4th floor. It was the historical archives section, notoriously silent, filled with towering wooden bookshelves. They were arranged in long rows, creating narrow corridors that felt like a maze. I found a single study desk tucked against the back wall, next to a window overlooking the quad. I unpacked my laptop and tried to focus. For an hour, it worked. The mechanical hum of the ventilation became a soothing white noise. The dread from my apartment faded. Then the hum stopped. It didn't fade out, it cut off abruptly, plunging the 4th floor into a heavy silence. I paused my typing. I waited for the backup generators to kick in. Nothing happened. The air felt very still, and the quiet was deafening. It was the kind of silence where you can hear your own blood pumping. I looked up from my glowing screen and peered down the center aisle. That was when I noticed the lights. The library was divided into sections, each illuminated by rows of overhead bulbs. At the opposite end of the floor, maybe 200 feet away, the lights flickered rapidly, a harsh strobe effect lasting 5 agonizing seconds. With a loud, mechanical clack that echoed through the room, that entire far section went totally dark. I stared at the black void. It was just a blown fuse, I told myself. Old buildings have electrical issues. I tried to look back at my screen, but my eyes kept darting back. Something felt fundamentally wrong. The air had grown noticeably colder. 5 minutes later, the lights in the next section began to aggressively flicker. The erratic flashing cast dancing shadows across the tall bookshelves. Then came that exact same heavy clack. The section was swallowed by the dark. The solid wall of pitch black was 20 feet closer to me. A tight knot of anxiety formed in my stomach. I stood up slowly. I leaned out slightly into the main aisle, straining my eyes to see if a maintenance worker was resetting breakers. No one was there, just empty desks and creeping shadows. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, sounding like the quiet rustling of dry leaves. But as I listened harder into the void, the sound clarified. It wasn't paper, it was whispering. It came from inside the darkened sections. Multiple unseen voices, layered over one another, speaking in a rapid, hushed tone lacking human emotion. I couldn't make out a distinct word, but the cadence was unnervingly fast. It sounded exactly like the breathless muttering I had heard through the wall of my apartment. My heart slammed against my ribs. I froze, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility. How could that exact sound follow me here? Before I could rationalize it, the lights in the section immediately adjacent to the darkness began to violently flicker. The rapid flashing illuminated the dusty aisles in stuttering bursts of white light. I watched in terror as distorted shadows danced wildly across the floor. Another massive section went completely dark. The wall of blackness was halfway across the floor, steadily marching toward my desk. As the darkness expanded, the breathless whispering grew louder. It was a physical sound echoing off the wooden shelves. The voices were flat, overlapping, and utterly relentless. I needed to pack my bag and run for the stairs, but my legs felt like lead. My primal brain screamed that a sudden movement would make whatever was hiding notice me. I slowly reached down to gently close my laptop lid. The metal hinge gave a tiny squeak. Instantly, the layered whispering stopped. The sudden silence was completely suffocating. I stood perfectly still, my sweating hand resting on the warm aluminum of my computer. I didn't dare breathe. I stared blankly into the blackness covering the front half of the floor, desperately trying to detect hidden movement. Then the lights right in front of my specific section began to violently flicker. The frantic buzzing sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. Through the strobing flashes, I thought I saw something standing completely still at the end of the aisle. It wasn't a person. It was just a shape, a dense cluster of deep shadow that seemed to absorb the flickering light around it. The heavy clack echoed again. The darkness was right in front of me. Only the narrow row of lights directly above my desk remained illuminated, casting a fragile pool of safety around my chair. Everywhere else on the massive floor was pitch black. I was trapped. The main staircase was completely submerged in the thick dark. The whispering started up again, but this time it wasn't a distant sound. It was right at the edge of the remaining light. It sounded like it was coming from just on the other side of the nearest bookshelf. I slowly backed away until my tense shoulders hit the cold glass of the exterior window. I looked out desperately at the empty campus below, praying to see anyone who could break this terrifying isolation, but the quad was deserted. When I turned back around, the light directly above my head gave a weak buzz. It was flickering. I squeezed my eyes shut, my body trembling. The awful buzzing grew louder, the bright light flashing against my closed eyelids in a sickening rhythm. The breathless whispering was now a chaotic rush of noise right inside my ears. I felt the temperature plummet, a blast of freezing, stale air washing over my face. The light above me snapped off. Total darkness swallowed me. I pressed my back so hard against the window I thought it might shatter. I held my breath until my lungs began to burn, waiting for whatever was making that muttering to reveal itself. The whispering was so loud it vibrated deep in my teeth. It felt like dozens of invisible people were standing mere inches from my frozen face, their cold breath washing over my skin as they spoke into the freezing air around me. I stubbornly kept my eyes clamped shut. I absolutely refused to open them. I don't know exactly how long I stood there, pinned against the glass in the freezing blackness. It could have been 10 agonizing minutes. It could have been an hour. Time stopped making sense. Suddenly, a loud, heavy thud echoed from the first-floor lobby, followed by the distant sound of the main, heavy glass doors pulling open and slamming shut. Immediately, the mechanical hum of the building's massive ventilation system kicked back on. The surrounding whispering stopped in an absolute instant. I opened my terrified eyes. The overhead lights on the fourth floor were still dead, but the oppressive, freezing weight hanging in the air was suddenly completely gone. The atmosphere around me felt entirely empty again. I didn't even bother grabbing my laptop or backpack. I blindly felt my way along the cold exterior wall, using my shaking hands to guide me past the wooden shelves. I practically fell down the dark main staircase in my blind panic, my heavy boots echoing wildly in the pitch-black stairwell. I didn't stop running until I hit the ground floor. When I finally burst out into the lobby, the ground floor overhead lights were blazing brightly. The campus security guard was finally sitting calmly behind the front podium, casually sipping from his coffee cup. He looked up at me in genuine surprise, visibly startled by my pale face and breathless panting. He casually asked if I was doing okay, calmly explaining that the electrical breaker for the upper floors had simply tripped by itself. I didn't bother answering him. I just pushed violently through the front glass doors and sprinted out into the freezing November night. I completely failed my history final the next morning, and I moved out of my off-campus apartment the very next afternoon, abandoning most of my furniture behind. It has been over 3 long years since that terrifying night. I still don't know what was actually muttering in my roommate's bedroom, or what horrific thing quietly followed me all the way into the historical archives. But even now, whenever I walk into an empty room and the lights give that slight, hesitant flicker before turning on, I freeze completely. Because I finally know what the absolute, deafening silence truly sounds like right before the suffocating darkness finally catches up to you. Story 10. I found a hidden folder on my laptop one morning after my terrifying experience in the empty parking lot. When I opened it, the pictures inside showed me sleeping every single night. My name is Jessica. At the time of this story, I was 22 and working a closing shift at a large, mostly abandoned outdoor shopping center. You probably know the exact type of place I mean. It used to be popular, but over the years, most of the big retail chains had packed up and left. Half the storefronts were boarded up, and by the time the sun went down, the sprawling property felt like a ghost town. My shift usually ended around 9:30 p.m., but on this particular Tuesday, my manager made us stay incredibly late for a massive end-of-year inventory check. By the time I finally pushed through the heavy glass exit doors, it was almost 11:45 p.m. The entire mall was completely dead. The upbeat ambient music that played endlessly through the outdoor speakers had been turned off hours ago. It was just me and the low, annoying hum of the fluorescent security lights attached to the brick walls. I pulled my jacket tight to fight off the late November chill. All I wanted was to get into my car, turn the heat on high, and drive home to my warm apartment. But employee parking was a miserable trek. Management made us park in the overflow lot, a massive stretch of cracked asphalt hidden away behind the shipping and receiving docks. At midnight, walking out there alone felt like an endless journey. The only illumination in the overflow lot came from tall, buzzing sodium street lamps casting a sickly, faded orange glow over the concrete. Half the bulbs were entirely burned out, leaving sprawling pools of pitch-black shadows wedged between the scattered employee cars. As I walked down the concrete loading ramp, the sound of my heavy boots scraped loudly against the pavement, echoing outward. I had this large metal keychain my sister bought me, and it jingled loudly with every single step. Normally, I liked the familiar sound, but tonight it made me feel completely exposed. It felt like I was broadcasting my exact location to anyone hiding in the dark. I quickly shoved the keys deep into my right coat pocket, squeezing them tightly to muffle the annoying metallic noise. I was about halfway to my car when I got that terrible sinking feeling. It is that heavy, prickly sensation right on the back of your neck telling you that someone unseen is staring intently at you. My instincts flared up instantly. I stopped walking for a second and looked around the vast, quiet space. The lot was still mostly empty. There were just a few older sedans parked haphazardly under the flickering orange lights. Nothing looked out of place at first. But then, as I scanned the perimeter, I saw it. 4 aisles over to my left, standing perfectly still in the deep, unnatural shadow of a rusted delivery van, was a person. It was just a tall, dark silhouette perfectly blending into the night. They were not walking toward a car. They were not looking down at a glowing phone screen. They were just standing there, facing my exact direction. My stomach immediately did a nervous little flip. I tried to rationalize the situation right away. I told myself it was probably an overnight janitor taking a quick smoke break in the dark, or maybe a tired security guard doing his routine perimeter rounds. It made logical sense, but something about their posture felt deeply wrong. They were far too stiff. Too impossibly still. They looked more like a discarded clothing mannequin left out in the lot than a living human. I forced myself to start walking again. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead on my car, which was parked under a completely working streetlight about 50 yards away. I told my brain to ignore it, do not look back at them. I walked forward for 30 tense seconds, my heart definitely beating faster in my chest now. Then I just could not help it. My anxiety won. I had to look. I turned my head just slightly over my left shoulder. The person was no longer standing by the rusted delivery van. They were now 2 full aisles closer to me, and they were still standing perfectly still. Their arms were hanging unnaturally straight down at their sides, like a soldier standing at attention. A freezing cold wave of raw panic washed over my entire body, freezing me in place for a second. I had not heard a single footstep behind me. The cracked pavement all around us was completely covered in dry, dead autumn leaves that had blown over from the nearby trees, but I had not heard a single crunch. It was physically impossible. How did they move that far and that fast without making a single sound? And more terrifyingly, why did they only move when I was actively looking away from them? I started walking much faster. I desperately wanted to run, but running meant that I was terrified, and I felt like running would trigger them to instantly chase me. I reached deep into my coat pocket and gripped my keys incredibly tightly. My fingers wrapped so hard around that heavy metal keychain that the rough edges dug painfully into the palm of my hand. The slight physical pain actually grounded me a little bit. I reached the end of my current row of cars. My vehicle was only 20 feet away from me now. I stopped at the rear bumper of a white sedan and gathered every ounce of courage I had left to look back one more time. My breath completely caught in my throat. They were right at the edge of the aisle now. Only 30 feet away from me, I still could not see a face, just a dark, heavy winter coat and an overwhelming, suffocating sense of wrongness. The absolute statue-like stillness was truly terrifying. That was the exact moment I finally broke. I stopped pretending that everything was fine and I sprinted the last 20 feet to my car. I yanked my keys out of my pocket with entirely too much force, my hands shaking so violently that I almost dropped them onto the pavement. The heavy metal keychain clanked incredibly loudly against the side of my car door. I frantically pressed the unlock button on my key fob. The car chirped twice in the silent night, and the headlights flashed on. In that brief, blinding flash of white light, I saw them. They had moved again. They were standing directly behind the white sedan I had just passed seconds ago. They were close enough now that I absolutely should have been able to see their face clearly in the headlights, but I could not. It was like their features were just an empty, dark blur. They were just standing there, angled slightly forward, like they were leaning in to eagerly watch me panic. I ripped the car door open, threw my entire body into the driver's seat, and violently slammed the heavy door shut. I hit the master lock button instantly. The loud thunk of all 4 doors locking was easily the best sound I had ever heard. I jammed the metal key into the ignition, twisted it hard, and the engine immediately roared to life. I threw the car into reverse and backed out so aggressively that my tires screeched loudly against the freezing asphalt. Shifting into drive, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and looked up into my rearview mirror. The figure did not run to chase my car. They just stood perfectly still in the empty space where my vehicle had been parked just seconds before. They stood entirely motionless under the dim orange light, just watching my red taillights leave the lot. I kept expecting to see headlights suddenly appear behind me, following me, but the road stayed completely empty. I did not take a full, proper breath until I was miles away, safely merging onto the brightly lit interstate highway. I got back to my apartment complex around 12:45 a.m. I ran from my car to my front door, looking over my shoulder the entire time. Once inside, I locked the heavy deadbolt. I walked through every single room, turning on the lights. I checked the windows, opened the closets, and even grabbed a flashlight to nervously check under my bed. The apartment was completely empty. I told myself I was safe. I spent the rest of the night sitting perfectly upright on my living room couch with all the lights still turned on. I sat wrapped in a thick blanket, staring blankly at the front door. Every time the floorboards creaked upstairs, my stomach completely dropped. By the time the sun came up, I was completely exhausted. I immediately called out of work that morning. There was no way I was going back to that mall anytime soon. I desperately needed a distraction to calm my lingering nerves. I walked into my bedroom and grabbed my laptop off the desk, carrying it out to the living room. When I opened the screen, I noticed a strange new icon sitting right in the middle of my desktop layout. It was just a plain yellow folder with absolutely no name underneath it. I frowned deeply, wondering if it was some weird glitch or maybe a virus I had accidentally downloaded the week before. My hand felt strangely clammy as I carefully hovered the mouse arrow over the yellow icon. I slowly double-clicked it. The folder opened instantly on my screen. Inside, there were dozens of individual image files neatly lined up. None of them had file names, just long, random strings of numbers and letters. My heart started to beat a little faster in my chest. I hesitated, then nervously clicked on the very first image file in the top row. It took a quiet second to load on the screen. When the picture finally popped up, all the air completely left my lungs. It was a high-resolution photograph of me. I was sound asleep in my own bed. The angle showed it was taken from the dark upper corner of my bedroom ceiling, pointing straight down at my face. Trembling violently, I quickly clicked the next arrow on the keyboard. Another photo loaded. It was me, sleeping deeply, wearing a completely different shirt. I clicked again. Another dark night. Dozens and dozens of photos. The digital timestamps on the hidden files went back for almost 3 solid months. The unnatural person standing in that empty parking lot had not followed me home last night. They were already there. They had been there every night. The terrifying encounter in the parking lot was just the very first time I had ever caught them watching me. Story 11. It was the first late-night subway ride I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. I was 22 at the time, working a closing shift at a diner right in the heart of the city. We were chronically understaffed, meaning I often ended up staying well past midnight just to finish cleaning the kitchen and prepping for the morning crew. On this particular night, it was a Tuesday in late November. The air outside was absolutely freezing, cutting right through my thin jacket as I walked the 3 blocks to the station. I was physically and mentally exhausted. My feet ached, my eyes were incredibly heavy, and all I wanted was to fall into my bed and sleep for a solid 10 hours. The station itself was eerily empty when I finally swiped my transit card. Usually there are at least a few other night owls or tired workers waiting around the platform, but tonight the entire place was completely deserted. I remember the fluorescent lights above me humming with this low, irritating mechanical buzz. Every few seconds, one of the older bulbs at the far end of the platform would faintly flicker. It cast long, strange shadows against the grimy, white-tiled walls. It felt weirdly isolated down there, almost like I had stepped out of the real world and into some forgotten underground bunker. When the train finally screeched into the empty station, the sound was absolutely deafening. The metallic grinding echoed harshly off the concrete walls, making me physically wince. The heavy doors slid open with a loud, hollow thud, and I stepped inside. As expected, the train car was completely empty. The bright overhead lights inside the train felt blinding compared to the dim, shadowy platform I had just left. I chose a seat near the exact middle of the car, right across from the sliding doors, and slumped heavily down against the hard orange plastic. The train sat there for what felt like an unusually long amount of time. The doors stayed wide open, letting in the damp, freezing air from the dark tunnel ahead. I pulled my jacket much tighter around myself, shivering slightly in the draft. I just wanted to get moving and get home. Finally, a robotic, automated voice announced the doors were closing. The train lurched forward with a heavy jolt, immediately plunging into the dark, endless tunnel. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the tracks usually puts me right to sleep on my daily commute. It's a repetitive, mindless sound that I've grown very used to over the last few years. But for some unexplained reason, tonight I could not relax. Every single time I closed my tired eyes, I felt this strange, prickling sensation slowly crawling up the back of my neck. It was that distinct, deeply uncomfortable feeling you get when you know someone is staring right at you. I kept opening my eyes and looking up and down the long length of the empty train car. There was absolutely no one. just rows of empty seats and the dark, smudged windows reflecting the brightly lit interior of the train right back at me. Since there was quite literally nothing else to look at, my eyes naturally drifted to the large window directly across the aisle from me. Because the subway tunnel outside was pitch black, the thick glass acted exactly like a perfect mirror. I could clearly see my own reflection sitting there in the harsh light. I looked absolutely terrible. My posture was slumped forward, my hair was a messy tangle, and I had heavy dark circles hanging under my eyes. I just stared blindly at myself for a while, spacing out completely as the train rattled loudly along the underground tracks. It was a 20-minute ride to my neighborhood stop, and I figured I would just zone out until I got there. The humming noise filled the silence. But the longer I blindly stared at my reflection, the more I slowly started to feel that something was slightly off. Have you ever stared at a common word for so long that it suddenly stops looking like a real word? It was exactly like that, but with my own face. My facial features seemed just a tiny fraction of an inch out of place. I quickly shook my head, blaming it entirely on sheer physical exhaustion and the harsh, unforgiving overhead lighting. I rubbed my eyes hard, feeling the dry grit of a long, stressful shift, and looked directly back at the dark window. My reflection smoothly rubbed its eyes too. Everything appeared perfectly normal. I took a deep, calming breath and slowly leaned my head back against the wall. I closed my eyes for maybe 30 seconds, simply trying to rest them from the blinding light for a brief moment. The speeding train swayed violently from side to side, rocking my body gently against the plastic seat. When I finally opened my eyes again, I looked straight ahead at the dark glass window. My reflection was looking right back at me, but something felt incredibly, deeply wrong. It took my sleep-deprived brain a few agonizing seconds to fully process what I was actually seeing. My physical head was resting flat against the hard wall directly behind me. I could feel the cold plastic against the back of my skull, but in the clear reflection right across from me, my head was distinctly tilted forward, chin resting slightly toward my chest. A sudden, freezing chill shot violently down my entire spine. I sat up straight immediately, my heart pounding. In the glass, my reflection sat up perfectly straight too. I let out a shaky, nervous breath, feeling incredibly stupid for being scared. I repeatedly told myself I must have been so incredibly tired that my strained eyes were just playing tricks on me. I forced a small, uneasy laugh, desperately trying to shake off the creeping sense of heavy dread. The quiet sound of my laugh sounded hollow and strange over the loud, rhythmic clacking of the fast train tracks. I kept my eyes completely locked on the dark window, determined to prove to myself that everything was totally fine. I stared hard into my own reflected, exhausted eyes, and then it happened. It was so incredibly fast I almost missed it, but I know exactly what I saw. I was staring straight ahead with my eyes forced wide open, but the reflection in the glass, it clearly blinked. My heart dropped violently into the very bottom of my stomach. My breath caught sharply in my tight throat. I did not blink. I know for an absolute fact I did not close my eyes, but the person staring back in the glass definitely had. The heavy eyelids in the window had fluttered shut for a clear split second before quickly snapping open again. My entire body instantly froze solid. I couldn't move a single muscle. I couldn't even look away. I just sat there paralyzed, completely consumed by this sudden, overwhelming wave of pure, unfiltered terror. The loud train just continued to speed blindly through the dark, endless tunnel, completely oblivious to what was happening inside the brightly lit car. I needed to desperately test it again. I had to know if I was actually losing my mind. My hands were shaking so badly I had to aggressively clench them into tight fists on my lap. Slowly, very carefully, I tilted my head to the left. The reflection accurately tilted its head to the right. Okay, normal. I slowly opened my mouth, just slightly. The reflection opened its mouth, still normal. I let out a long, very shaky sigh of relief and allowed my tense shoulders to drop. I broke eye contact with the terrifying reflection for the very first time in minutes, looking down at my shoes. I took one more deep breath to forcefully calm my racing heart. Then, I slowly lifted my head to look out the dark window one absolute last time. When my eyes met the reflection again, all the air left my lungs. I was not smiling. My face was completely blank, pale and rigid with fear. But the thing in the window, it was smiling directly at me. It wasn't a normal smile. The corners of its mouth were pulled up way too high, stretching the skin tightly across its cheeks. It was an exaggerated, unnatural grin that exposed too many teeth. My survival instincts violently screamed at me to run, but I was completely trapped. The thing in the window kept smiling that horrific, frozen smile. And then it slowly leaned forward, resting its reflected hands heavily against the glass from the dark side of the tunnel. It just stared at me, its chest rising and falling rhythmically, breathing excitedly. I found my voice, scrambling frantically backward into the aisle. I fell onto the dirty floor, scrambling to the opposite doors. The train began screeching to a loud stop. The robotic voice announced my station. As the doors hissed open, I didn't hesitate. I threw myself out of the train, sprinting up the stairs into the night air. I never looked back. That was over a year ago. I quit my late-night job the next week. Even now, standing safely in my own home, I refuse to look out dark windows at night. Because sometimes, when the room is totally quiet, I swear I can see a faint, grinning face subtly reflecting back at me in the glass, waiting for me to blink. Story 12. It was the first night at the hotel I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. I was in town for a training seminar. My company booked me a room at a generic chain hotel off the highway. It wasn't fancy, just a place to sleep. I remember walking into the lobby around 8:30 p.m. feeling completely drained. The drive took almost 6 hours. All I wanted was a hot shower and sleep. The desk clerk handed me my keycard with a tired smile. Room 412. I dragged my suitcase into the elevator. The doors slid shut with a metallic clunk. The fourth-floor hallway smelled of industrial carpet cleaner. The overhead lights had a slight flicker. It hurt my eyes. I swiped my card. The green light flashed. I pushed the heavy door open, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. The room was exactly what you'd expect. A queen-sized bed in the middle, a desk against the wall, a flat-screen television in the corner. Right by the entryway across from the bathroom was a standard wooden closet. I dropped my suitcase and let out a long breath. The room was incredibly quiet. The only sound was the steady hum of the mini fridge. I locked the deadbolt and flipped the security latch. It felt good to be isolated. No roommates, just me in a quiet space. I took a quick shower to wash off the road. The hot water felt incredible on my neck, loosening the knots that had formed from staring at highway lines all afternoon. I stood under the stream for a long time, just letting the heat soak into my skin. When I got out, the bathroom mirror was completely fogged over. I wiped away the condensation to look at my reflection. I just looked exhausted. I dried off, put on sleep clothes, and walked into the main room. I turned off the main light, leaving only the small lamp on the nightstand casting a dim glow. It was 10:15 p.m. I pulled the comforter back and slid under the sheets. I laid there staring at the ceiling. The mattress was firm, but I didn't care. I closed my eyes, letting exhaustion take over. The silence wrapped around me. I was hovering on the edge of sleep when I heard it, a soft, brief rustling sound. It broke the quiet just enough to make my eyes snap open. I lay there in the dim light, listening. The fridge was still humming, but beneath it I definitely heard something else. It sounded like thick fabric rubbing against wood, like a heavy coat shifting against a door. I turned my head slowly toward the entryway. The wooden closet door was closed tight. The shadows in that corner were deep. I told myself it was just the building settling or the air conditioning vent. But the vent was clear across the room and the sound came from near the door. I waited for a few minutes. My heart was beating faster. I strained my ears, listening for movement. The sound didn't happen again. Just the fridge. I convinced myself I was just jumpy. I closed my eyes again. It took a long time, but I finally drifted off. I don't know how long I slept. I woke up suddenly with a gasp. The room was freezing. The kind of unnatural cold that bites at your skin. I pulled the blanket up to my chin. I glanced at the digital clock on the nightstand. It was 2:14 a.m. I rubbed my eyes, feeling that disorienting confusion you get waking up in the middle of the night. And then I heard it again. The rustling, but it wasn't just a quick brush this time. It was a sustained, slow shifting, like someone deliberately adjusting their weight in a cramped space. It was unmistakably coming from the closet. The wooden door muffled the noise, making it sound hollow, but it was right there in my room. My stomach completely dropped. The cold air suddenly felt suffocating. I sat up very slowly in the bed. I didn't want the mattress to squeak. I stared at the closet door. It was just a dark rectangle hidden in the shadows. I tried to think logically. Maybe the hangers were swaying from a draft, but hotel closets don't have drafts. Maybe mice in the walls, but the sound was far too heavy. It sounded like significant mass moving against the wood. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep unless I looked. It's that stupid human instinct to confirm there is nothing to fear. I threw the covers off and stood up. The carpet felt ice cold. I took one step toward the entryway. The rustling inside the closet immediately stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It felt like whatever was making the sound had stopped specifically because it heard me moving. I froze halfway across the room. I held my breath, terrified to make a sound. Nothing, just the low hum of the fridge. I forced my legs to keep walking. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to just turn around, grab my car keys, and walk out of the room. But my exhaustion and disbelief kept me moving forward. I told myself I was being completely ridiculous. I reached the closet. I wrapped my shaking hand around the cool metal handle. I braced myself, fully expecting a stray cat that had somehow gotten trapped. I pulled the heavy door open fast. The small light inside flickered on automatically. I blinked against the brightness. I looked down at the floor, then up at the top shelf. Empty. There was absolutely nothing in there. 3 wooden hangers dangling from the metal rod. No coat, no animal, no person, just an empty hotel closet. I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I actually laughed a little bit at myself, just an exhausted imagination playing tricks on me. I shook my head, feeling foolish, and pushed the door closed. The metal latch clicked, the little light shut off. I turned my back to it and took exactly 1 step toward the bed. Then the sound started again, but it was entirely different this time. It wasn't a soft rustle, it was a heavy, deliberate scrape, like the hard rubber sole of a shoe dragging slowly across the wooden floorboards right behind that door. I froze. My entire body went completely rigid. The hair on my arms stood straight up. It was loud, much louder than before. It sounded impossible. I had just looked inside less than 5 seconds ago. There was nowhere to hide. It was an empty box. I didn't turn around. I couldn't bring myself to look back at the door. The dragging sound stopped, replaced by a slow, agonizingly rhythmic creaking. It was the sound of old wood taking on heavy weight. Something large was pressing against the inside of the closet door. I could hear the faint strain of the metal hinges protesting. Whatever was in there was shifting its balance, physically leaning against the thin barrier separating us. Felt as if the wood was going to splinter outward at any second. I could vividly picture something enormous pressing its back against the door, pushing outward with all its might. The air in the room felt thick, almost hard to breathe. I felt dizzy. I wanted to run for the main door, but that meant walking right past the closet. I stood completely still in the center of the room. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Could it be someone in the hallway leaning on the wall? No, the acoustics were entirely wrong. The sound was undeniably coming from inside the hollow space of the closet. Then a terrifying new sound began, a very faint, incredibly shallow wheezing. It was muffled, breathing in and out slowly in the dark. It sounded broken, like someone struggling to take in air through a wet piece of cloth. The wet wheezing grew slightly louder, and then the metal handle of the closet door gave a sharp rattle. That was it. The rational part of my brain shut off. Panic took over. I didn't grab my suitcase. I didn't grab my clothes. I lunged toward the nightstand and snatched my phone and keys. The door handle rattled again, more violently this time. I backed away toward the main hotel door, never taking my eyes off the closet. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the deadbolt. As I turned the lock, the breathing inside the closet suddenly stopped. Dead silence fell over the room again. I pulled the main door open and stepped out into the flickering light of the hallway. The smell of industrial carpet cleaner hit me immediately. I was about to pull the door shut behind me when I saw it. I couldn't look away. In the dim light of the room, the handle on the closet door slowly turned on its own. With a faint creak, the heavy wooden door drifted open about an inch. A wall of pitch-black darkness waited in the crack. I didn't wait to see what was going to push its way out. I slammed my hotel door shut, ran down the 4 flights of stairs, and never went back up. I left my bags. I left my clothes. I drove for 2 hours in the dark before I even felt safe enough to pull over. I still don't know what was inside that cramped space with me, but I know it was waiting for me to go to sleep. Story 13. This happened during my overnight stay at a rural farmhouse. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. The farmhouse had belonged to my family for generations. It sat on the edge of a massive, empty property in the middle of nowhere. There were no streetlights and no neighbors. The closest town was a 45-minute drive away. I was 22 at the time. I volunteered to spend the weekend there to clean up the place. We were planning to put it on the market soon. I thought it would be a very quiet weekend. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon. The sky was turning dark gray, threatening a heavy storm. The property looked exactly how I remembered it from childhood. It was an old wooden house with a wraparound porch surrounded by acres of overgrown grass. When I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the air felt incredibly stale and cold. The house had been empty for months. I spent the first few hours wiping down counters and sweeping the dusty floors. By the time the sun went down, the isolation really started to set in. When it gets dark out in the country, it is a completely different kind of dark. It is pitch black. You cannot see your own hand in front of your face, and the silence is so heavy it rings in your ears. I made sure all the doors were locked and pulled the curtains closed over the windows. I did not like feeling so exposed. Around 9:30 p.m., the wind started to really pick up. I could hear it howling through the old trees outside. Soon after, the rain started. It was a torrential downpour beating heavily against the roof and the sides of the house. I was sitting in the living room on a dusty couch, scrolling through my phone. The cell service was terrible. The house felt way too quiet, even with the massive storm raging violently right outside the front door. That was when I heard the first sound. It was a distinct, rhythmic tapping noise coming directly from the kitchen window. Tap, tap, tap. I quickly paused my phone and listened closely. The sound stopped completely. I figured it was just a loose tree branch blowing in the wind and hitting the glass. The old oak tree in the side yard had branches that reached pretty close to the house. I brushed it off and went back to my phone. A few minutes passed and I started to finally relax again. Then the tapping started up again. This time it was slightly louder, and it wasn't coming from the kitchen anymore. It was coming from the dining room window right next to the living room. Tap, tap, tap. My heart did a jump in my chest. I sat up straight and stared hard at the heavy curtains covering the window. The wind was still blowing hard outside. I desperately tried to convince myself it was just storm debris blowing against the side of the house, but the slow rhythm of it was simply too steady. It sounded extremely intentional, like someone slowly knocking with a single knuckle. I stood up from the couch and slowly walked over to the dining room window. The floorboards creaked loudly under my feet. I pulled the edge of the curtain back just a tiny bit and peered out into the darkness. I could not see anything at all. The rain was coming down so hard, and the absolute darkness swallowed everything outside the glass. I stood there for a long time, just watching the empty space outside, waiting for a flash of lightning. Nothing moved. I let the heavy curtain fall back into place and took a deep breath. I was just letting the creepy old house get into my head. I decided it was time to call it a night. I turned off the living room lamp and walked down the hallway. The first floor bedroom was located at the very back of the house. I changed into my sleeping clothes, turned off the light, and got into the cold bed. I laid there in the dark, listening to the rain hit the roof. I was just starting to drift off to sleep when I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. My eyes snapped open instantly. The sound was closer. It was coming directly from my bedroom window. A freezing cold wave of dread washed over me. The wind could blow a branch against the kitchen window, but there were absolutely no trees near the back of the house. There was nothing that could accidentally hit my bedroom window in the storm. I lay perfectly still in the bed, barely breathing, terrified to make a single sound. The tapping stopped for a few agonizing seconds, and then it started again. Tap, tap, tap. It was incredibly slow, deliberate, patient. I slowly sat up in the dark bed. My mind was racing fast, desperately trying to find a logical explanation. Someone was out there. Someone was standing in the freezing pouring rain in the pitch-black dark, moving from room to room, tapping on the glass. The terrifying thought made my stomach twist in knots. I did not have a weapon. I barely had any cell service. I was completely alone. I carefully crept out of bed, making sure to step on the edges of the floorboards so they wouldn't creak. I slowly approached the bedroom window. The curtains were drawn tight. The soft tapping continued. It was right on the other side of the glass, just inches away from my face. I raised my hand, my fingers trembling slightly in the cool air, and gently grasped the edge of the fabric. Did I really want to see what was out there? I gathered whatever courage I had left and quickly yanked the curtain back. I pressed my face close to the cold glass, trying to see through the heavy rain and the dense darkness. At first I saw nothing at all, just the endless black of the empty fields. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a sudden wave of immense relief wash over me. There was no one there. It must have just been the wind playing tricks on me. I turned away from the window, fully ready to get back into bed and hide under the covers. But right as I turned around, I heard the sound again. It was not coming from the window this time. It was coming from the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. I froze entirely in place. The blood completely drained from my face. The sound was unmistakably coming from inside the house. I had meticulously checked all the doors. I had securely locked them myself. How could someone or something possibly be inside the house with me? I slowly walked to the bedroom doorway and peered out into the dark hallway. The house was dead silent, aside from the heavily muffled sound of the storm raging outside. The dark shadows seemed to stretch and twist strangely in the dim light. I strained my eyes, desperately trying to see any movement in the dark. Then I clearly heard it again. It was coming from the living room. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded exactly like it was coming from the large decorative mirror hanging directly above the fireplace. I swallowed hard, my throat feeling completely dry. I stepped out of the bedroom and started walking slowly down the dark hallway. Every single step felt like it took an absolute eternity. My bare feet made absolutely no sound on the cold wooden floor. As I reached the edge of the living room, I stopped and hid behind the doorframe. I carefully leaned my head around the corner to look. The room looked completely empty. The dusty couch was exactly where I left it. The curtains were closed tightly against the storm, but the rhythmic tapping sound was louder now. It was definitely coming from the mirror. I took a deep breath and stepped fully into the dark room. I walked slowly toward the mirror, my heart pounding incredibly hard. As I got closer, the tapping stopped completely. The sudden silence was almost worse than the sound itself. I stood directly in front of the mirror. It was too dark to see my own reflection clearly. It was just a dark silhouette. I leaned in closer, squinting to see if anything was wrong with the glass. I put my hand on the cool surface, searching for an explanation. That was when the lightning flashed outside. It lit up the room for just a fraction of a second. But a fraction of a second was all I needed to see the terrifying truth. In the brief flash of light, I did not see my reflection staring back at me. I saw the faint, pale outline of a face. It was pressed right up against the glass as if it was trapped inside. Its eyes were incredibly wide and its mouth was open in a silent scream. I stumbled backward, crying out in terror. I tripped over the edge of the rug and fell hard onto the floorboards. I scrambled backward, crawling away from the mirror as fast as I possibly could. The room plunged back into darkness. I grabbed my car keys from the kitchen counter and bolted for the front door. I fumbled with the heavy deadbolt, finally managed to unlock it, and ran out into the pouring rain. I threw the car into drive and sped down the muddy driveway. I never went back to that farmhouse. The scariest part isn't what I saw that night. The scariest part is knowing the tapping followed me from room to room, mimicking someone outside, but the face was inside all along, watching me. I still refuse to sleep in a room with an uncovered mirror, because I know they are always watching us back. Story 14. This happened on a cold mall security night. I thought the tapping on my window was just branches, but it was. My name is Megan. At the time this incident took place, I was 22 years old and completely unsure of what I wanted to do with my life. To pay my rent, I had recently taken a job working the overnight graveyard shift at a massive, severely outdated indoor shopping mall in the Midwest. It was one of those sprawling, multi-level commercial centers built in the 1980s that had slowly been dying over the past decade. Most of the original storefronts were entirely empty, boarded up, or temporarily replaced by bizarre, cheaply thrown together pop-up shops. The property owners were desperately trying to keep the massive building afloat, which meant they still required 24-hour security on the premises, even though there was barely anything of value left inside to actually protect. The job was incredibly isolating and honestly very boring. The main security office was tucked away far down a long, narrow service corridor located directly behind the central food court. It was a very cramped, poorly ventilated little room that always smelled faintly of old coffee, burnt ozone, and dusty commercial carpet. One entire wall of the room was completely taken up by a massive, intimidating array of heavy, boxy CRT monitors. These screens constantly displayed the grainy, low-resolution, black and white feeds from the dozens of old security cameras scattered throughout the massive building. The opposite wall of the small office featured a single, narrow window that looked out into the rear exterior loading dock area. The glass was incredibly thick, reinforced with wire mesh, and perpetually smudged with years of grime and dirt. My nightly routine was always very straightforward and predictable. I would arrive at the mall at 11 p.m., manually lock the heavy glass main entrance doors behind me, and settle into the cheap rolling chair in front of the wall of monitors. I was technically supposed to do physical walking rounds of the property twice a night, but the mall was so huge, echoing, and incredibly dark that I usually just stayed hidden away inside the office. The massive building made a lot of strange, unsettling, settling noises at night. The old water pipes groaned loudly within the walls, the massive air conditioning units on the roof constantly shuddered and clanked, and sometimes the large, heavy metal security gates pulled across the empty storefronts would rattle slightly from the indoor drafts. It was definitely a creepy environment, but after a few weeks, you eventually got used to it. On this particular night, the weather outside the building was completely miserable. It was the middle of January, and a bitter, freezing winter wind was violently howling through the empty, sprawling parking lots. I had a small, cheap electric space heater plugged in under my desk to try and keep my legs warm as the hours slowly dragged on. Around 1:15 a.m., I heard the very first noise. It was a light, distinct, rhythmic tapping coming from the small glass window directly to my left. Tap, tap, tap. I immediately paused, taking my exhausted eyes off the glowing security screens and looked over at the dirty glass. It was pitch black outside. The large exterior floodlights in the loading dock had been broken for weeks, so all I could really see in the dark window was the pale reflection of my own face and the eerie, shifting glow of the security monitors directly behind me. I listened closely, holding my breath, waiting for the strange sound to happen again. The heavy wind was roaring outside the walls, forcefully throwing small bits of icy debris against the brick exterior of the massive building. I logically figured the wind had just blown a loose, dead branch against the glass. It made complete sense to me at the time. I quickly turned my attention back to the wall of screens and tried to mentally shake off the sudden, sharp spike of nervous anxiety in my chest. The large mall was divided into 4 main wings branching out from a massive central atrium. Most of the functioning cameras were pointed directly at the wide, tiled promenades and the major glass entrances. The video feeds were incredibly low resolution, automatically switching between different angles every 10 seconds. At around 2 a.m., my eyes were really starting to get heavy. I reached blindly for my lukewarm cup of coffee, staring blankly at the bottom row of monitors. That was exactly when I noticed something completely wrong on camera 4. Camera 4 covered the long south wing, located near an old, permanently abandoned department store. The video feed was full of static and heavily shadowed, but there was a very distinct, deliberate movement in the lower right corner of the small screen. I instantly leaned forward in my rolling chair, squinting hard at the glowing, curved glass. Someone was walking through the mall. It was a very dark, noticeably tall figure. Because of the terrible camera quality and the complete lack of overhead lighting in the corridors, I couldn't make out any specific features at all. There was no visible face, no distinct clothing details, just a solid, unnatural silhouette. They were walking slowly, almost casually, right down the exact center of the tiled walkway. My stomach dropped instantly. The main doors were heavily deadbolted from the inside. The rear service entrances were padlocked and chained. Absolutely nobody should have been inside the building. I was supposed to be completely alone. My very first frantic thought was that it simply had to be a local teenager pulling a stupid prank, maybe someone who had hidden in a public bathroom before closing time just to explore the dark mall. But there was something deeply, instinctively unsettling about the way this unknown person was moving. They weren't sneaking around at all. They weren't checking the locked storefronts or trying to break into anything. They were just strolling leisurely through the pitch-black, silent mall, seemingly completely unaffected by the heavy darkness. I watched nervously as the tall figure eventually disappeared from the tight frame of camera 4. A very cold, uncomfortable sweat started to form on the back of my neck. I quickly began scanning the dozens of other monitors, desperately trying to pick up their continuing path through the building. A few tense moments later, they abruptly appeared on camera 7, which directly covered the massive central atrium. The dark figure walked slowly into the wide, open space and then suddenly stopped completely. They just stood there, perfectly still, right next to the drained, empty central water fountain. I held my breath, waiting anxiously to see what they would do next. The automated security feed refreshed, cutting to a completely different angle of the atrium, and the tall figure was still standing there, completely unmoving. Then very slowly, they turned their head. They looked directly up at the security camera mounted high on the second-floor railing. A heavy, suffocating wave of pure dread washed over me. Even though the face was just a completely blurred mess of gray pixels, I felt an intense, overwhelming sensation that they were looking right at me. Through the dirty lens, through the old wires, right into the small, cramped office where I sat alone. My mouth went completely dry. I grabbed the heavy plastic walkie-talkie from the desk, my hands shaking uncontrollably, even though I logically knew there was absolutely no one else on the radio channel to answer me. I thought about immediately calling the local police, but a strange, heavy hesitation kept me frozen in my seat. What if it was just a confused homeless person who had somehow found a broken vent to stay warm? What if I was completely overreacting and would lose my job for calling the cops over nothing? The camera feed automatically switched again, returning to the original wide angle of the empty atrium. The figure was completely gone. Panic quickly flared hot in my chest. I desperately scanned the entire wall of glowing monitors, my eyes darting frantically from screen to screen. Camera 3 was completely empty. Camera 9 was empty. Camera 12, covering the messy food court, was empty. The entire massive mall was completely deserted once again. Where did they go? They couldn't have just vanished into thin air. I cautiously kept my eyes glued to the monitors for what felt like an absolute eternity. The heavy silence in the small office was deafening, broken only by the low, continuous electronic hum of the old screens and the howling winter wind outside the walls. Then it happened again. Tab, tab, tab. It was coming directly from the small glass window to my left, the exact same rhythmic, deliberate sound as before. I slowly turned my head. My heart was hammering against my ribs so incredibly hard it actually physically hurt. I stared blindly at the dirty glass, trying desperately to see through my own pale, terrified reflection. I slowly stood up from my chair, my legs feeling like they were suddenly made of heavy lead, and took a slow, hesitant step toward the dark window. I nervously cupped my hands around my eyes and pressed my face close to the freezing cold glass, trying to peer out into the pitch-black loading dock area. I strained my eyes as hard as I could, looking for any sign of movement in the dark outside. There was absolutely nothing, just the empty, cracked concrete of the delivery area. I let out a very shaky, shallow breath, quickly stepping back away from the wall. I rubbed my tired eyes, feeling completely exhausted and mentally overwhelmed. My mind was definitely just playing tricks on me. The heavy stress of the dark, the deep isolation, the incredibly creepy security footage. It was all finally getting to my head. I slowly turned back toward the main desk to sit back down. As I did, my eyes briefly caught a small, forgotten detail that I had completely overlooked earlier in the night, something that made the blood instantly freeze solid in my veins. I clearly remembered the rhythmic tapping sound. I remembered specifically telling myself it was just a loose, dead branch blowing from the heavy wind. But as I stood there, looking at the mental layout of the exterior loading dock in my mind, a horrifying, sickening realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. There were absolutely no trees anywhere behind the mall. The entire exterior loading dock was just a massive, empty expanse of flat, poured concrete surrounded entirely by a very tall, barbed chain-link fence. There were no bushes, no stray branches, absolutely nothing outside that could ever possibly reach the high window. Whatever had been tapping on the glass earlier wasn't the winter wind. I stood completely paralyzed in the very center of the cramped security office. My breathing became incredibly shallow and painfully fast. I absolutely didn't want to look back at the dark window again. I slowly backed up until the back of my legs finally hit the hard plastic edge of the rolling chair, and I collapsed heavily into it, staring blankly straight ahead at the glowing wall. I desperately needed to call the police immediately. I reached blindly for the old landline phone resting on the desk, my fingers trembling violently as I finally picked up the heavy plastic receiver. As I nervously held the phone up to my ear, waiting anxiously for a dial tone, my terrified eyes drifted naturally back up to the massive wall of security monitors. I subconsciously began scanning the glowing screens again out of pure, terrified habit. I quickly checked the specific feed for the long corridor located right outside my locked office door. Camera 2. The dim hallway was completely empty. The heavy, reinforced metal door to my office remained firmly and safely shut. Nobody was standing out there. But then my panicked gaze shifted slowly to the very top right corner of the massive monitor wall. Camera 16. It was the specific security camera mounted high up in the upper corner of the security office itself. It was mainly used by the property management to occasionally ensure the overnight guards weren't secretly sleeping on the job. I rarely ever looked at it because it was just a boring, live, continuous feed of my own back as I sat alone at the main desk. I stared in absolute horror at the black and white image on screen 16. I clearly saw the back of my own head. I saw the cheap rolling chair I was currently sitting in. I saw my shaking hand holding the telephone receiver tightly to my ear. And I saw the tall, dark figure standing directly behind me inside the locked room. They were standing perfectly still, positioned only a few inches away from the very back of my chair. Their posture was incredibly relaxed, their long arms hanging loosely and silently at their sides. A sickening, totally suffocating wave of pure, paralyzing terror washed violently over my entire body. My throat tightened up so severely I couldn't even force out a small gasp for air. The stale air inside the tiny room suddenly felt freezing cold, and I could actually feel a faint, subtle shift in the air pressure right behind my exposed neck. They hadn't been tapping on the outside of the glass window earlier. They had been tapping on the inside. I remained absolutely frozen in place, staring wide-eyed at the glowing monitor. I watched helplessly as the dark figure on the screen slowly began to raise one obscured hand, quietly reaching out toward the back of my neck. I didn't turn around, I just sat there in the heavy silence, waiting. Story 15. During my trip to the silent beach, I was staying in a basement apartment. At first the noises upstairs seemed normal, until I realized they weren't coming from upstairs. I had rented this place for a week in late October. I wanted to escape the city and clear my head. The rental was a somewhat outdated house sitting directly on the shoreline. The owners lived on the main floor, but they were out of town. They left the entire property completely empty. I was set up in the basement unit, which had its own private entrance facing the water. It smelled faintly of salt and old wood. The only real issue was the thick, unyielding fog. It rolled in every evening right after sunset. The fog swallowed the beach whole, turning the view from my window into a wall of gray nothingness. I didn't mind it at first. I actually found the extreme isolation peaceful. My routine for the first few days was simple. I would wake up late, read, and take long walks along the water. The beach was always completely deserted. By the time night fell, the air would get freezing cold and I would lock myself inside. I felt perfectly safe. The sound of the crashing waves was usually a constant rhythm. It echoed through the thin walls of the basement constantly. It was a comforting background noise that always helped me sleep. But on the fourth night, things started to feel slightly off. I was sitting on the worn-out couch, watching a movie on my laptop. It was around 11:30 p.m. The wind was howling outside, rattling the window frames. That was when I started hearing the footsteps. They were slow thuds coming from the ceiling directly above me. The main floor was supposed to be completely empty. I paused my movie and just sat there listening. The thudding stopped almost immediately. I tried to convince myself it was just the old house settling. Or maybe the aggressive wind was playing tricks on my ears. Old coastal houses take a brutal beating from the weather, so weird noises are guaranteed. I shook it off, but I felt a knot forming in my stomach. The air in the room suddenly felt stagnant and heavy. I decided I needed to get out for a few minutes. I needed fresh air to clear the sudden anxiety building in my chest. I grabbed my winter coat and a heavy flashlight. Sliding the glass door open, I stepped out into the freezing night. The fog was incredibly dense tonight. The beam of my flashlight barely cut through the gray mist. It illuminated only a few feet of wet sand. I zipped my coat up to my chin and started walking toward the water. The sound of the ocean was roaring. The dark waves were crashing violently against the shore. The harsh wind was whipping constantly past my ears. It was loud, chaotic, and completely normal for a late coastal storm. I kept my head down, focusing on the wet sand crunching beneath my heavy boots. I walked for about 10 minutes, letting the freezing wind numb my face. I started to actually feel a bit better. The open space made the slight claustrophobia of the basement fade away. But then something completely impossible happened. The transition wasn't gradual at all. It didn't fade out over a few minutes. It happened in less than a single second. Everything around me just stopped. The roaring ocean waves, the howling sea wind, the crunching of the sand under my boots, it all went completely silent. I stopped walking immediately. I stood frozen on the empty beach, my flashlight beam shaking in my grip. I could still see the massive waves crashing violently against the shore just a few yards away. I could see the dark water exploding into white sea foam. I could actually feel the freezing wind tearing at my coat, but there was absolutely no sound. It was like someone had hit a massive mute button on the world. The silence was so heavy it physically hurt my inner ears. It created a high-pitched ringing pressure deep inside my head. I opened my mouth to take a panicked breath. I couldn't even hear myself inhale. The panic hit me instantly. This wasn't a natural weather phenomenon. This was something deeply wrong. I frantically tapped the side of my head with my palm. I was thinking maybe something was seriously wrong with my hearing. Maybe the extreme cold had done something to my eardrums. But as I stood there in the crushing, unnatural quiet, a sound finally broke through the total void. It wasn't the wind or the violent water. It was a human voice. A dry, raspy whisper, spoken directly into my right ear. It was so incredibly close, I swear I felt the warmth of actual breath against my freezing skin. I couldn't make out the exact words. It sounded like a frantic, breathless string of wet syllables. It was entirely devoid of any human emotion. I spun around violently, swinging my flashlight in a wide arc. The bright beam cut through the thick fog, but there was absolutely nothing there. Just empty wet sand and swirling gray mist. I was completely alone on the dark shoreline. My heart was hammering painfully against my ribs. I could feel my rapid pulse throbbing heavily in my neck, but I still couldn't hear the blood rushing in my ears. I just started running. I didn't care about looking back into the fog. I desperately needed to get away from the dark water and back to the house. The sprint felt exactly like a bad nightmare. My heavy boots were sinking deep into the wet sand, terribly slowing me down. I was gasping desperately for air, but the unnatural silence swallowed every single sound I made. It literally felt like I was running deep underwater. The fog seemed to thicken around me on purpose, completely disorienting my sense of direction. I kept expecting to violently bump into whoever had just whispered to me, but the wide beach remained totally empty. After what felt like an absolute eternity, the faint outline of the house emerged from the thick mist. The basement light was still glowing warmly through the sliding glass door. I reached the door, practically throwing my entire body weight against the cold glass. I fumbled wildly with the handle, sliding it open and collapsing inside onto the floor. I slammed the heavy door shut behind me, locking it instantly and pulling the thin curtains closed. I backed away on my hands and knees until I hit the opposite wall. I slid down to the cold floor. I sat there in the dimly lit basement, shivering uncontrollably from the cold and the adrenaline. I desperately waited for the ambient noise of the room to finally return. I waited to hear the familiar hum of the old refrigerator. I waited for the whir of my laptop fan or the violent wind rattling the window glass, but the terrifying, unnatural silence had followed me directly inside. The room was entirely mute. I grabbed my laptop from the couch and immediately hit play on the movie. The screen showed the actors moving, their mouths opening and closing in dramatic arguments. But the speakers were completely dead. My own ragged, desperate breathing was completely silent. I was trapped in an absolute, crushing void. I pulled my knees tightly to my chest, trying to process what was actually happening. I was entirely alone in a soundless, dead environment. The peaceful isolation I had wanted was now physically suffocating me. I sat on the floor for what felt like hours. My phone had absolutely no signal down here, and even if it did, what would I even say? That the entire world had randomly gone completely quiet. No one would ever believe me. I kept my tired eyes locked on the sliding glass door. I was terrified of what might suddenly emerge from the thick fog outside. I watched the digital clock on the small oven slowly change numbers. It was exactly 2:15 a.m. The dead silence hadn't broken for over 2 straight hours. The horrible ringing in my ears was becoming almost unbearable. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to forcefully calm myself down. That was when I finally felt it, a slight, unnatural vibration passing directly through the floorboards beneath me. It was rhythmic, a steady, deliberate pressure forcefully pressing down into the old wood. I opened my eyes quickly, staring up at the ceiling. I suddenly remembered the heavy noises from earlier that night, the heavy footsteps supposedly coming from the empty main floor above me. I watched the dust motes drifting in the dim light. I waited for the ceiling panels to creak under the shifting weight. But the ceiling remained perfectly still. The vibrations weren't coming from above me at all. I placed my sweating palms flat against the cold floor. I tried tracing the source of the subtle movement. The rhythmic thudding was getting stronger, sending weak, terrifying tremors up my shaking arms. Moving slowly across the room. It started near the glass door, packing deliberately toward the center of the basement, but there was absolutely nothing there. The space was completely empty. The unseen vibrations moved right past the coffee table. They circled the couch and stopped directly in front of where I was sitting. I held my breath, pulling myself back as far as the drywall would allow. The air right in front of my face grew freezing cold. A sickening smell of stagnant salt water flooded my nose. The total silence was suddenly shattered. That exact same raspy whisper from the beach spoke clearly into my left ear. It simply said, "I followed you." The sheer panic forced me to my feet. I bolted out the door and never returned to that house. Even now, I sleep with a fan on, because when things get too quiet, I start to feel that freezing pressure leaning down next to me.